Chapter 1. The Prince of Midnight. The winds howled through the broken towers of Blackthorn Keep, carrying with them the whispers of the dead. The fortress stood like a malignant tumor in the heart of Sylvania, its crumbling stone walls half choked by ivy and the gnarled roots of twisted trees. Prince Valerius Von Carstein stood upon the balcony of his great hall, his sharp gaze fixed upon the distant horizon, where the black forests met the moonlit sky. A pale, sickly moon hung above the land like the eye of a dying god, casting an eerie glow upon the courtyard below. There his thralls gathered in silence, pale, hollow-cheeked men and women draped in rags, their blood-drained bodies obedient to his will. Among them stood his chosen warriors, clad in darkened mail, their faces hidden behind grotesque visors shaped like snarling wolves. Valerius breathed in the night air, savoring the stench of rot and damp earth, the scent of a land long abandoned by the living. His home, his prison, a court of shadows. Inside the great hall, the fires burned low, casting flickering shadows against the stone walls. The chamber was vast but cold, lined with banners bearing the sigil of his house, a black bat with crimson wings stitched into decayed velvet. At the head of the hall, upon a throne of bone and blackened steel, Valerius sat, fingers idly drumming against the armrest. A group of human envoys from Stirland stood before him, their faces tight with barely concealed terror. The leader, a gaunt man with thinning hair, attempted to mask his fear behind a facade of bravado. "Prince Valerius, we come on behalf of Baron Richter," the man began, his voice cracking. "The Baron extends his deepest concerns over the recent disappearances along the border. He requests your assistance in ensuring that the peace is maintained." Valerius smiled, a slow, practiced thing, the kind of smile a wolf gives to a lamb before the slaughter. Peace. His voice was smooth, cultured, but beneath it lurked something inhuman. "Ah, my dear friend, I have always ensured peace. Sylvania is quiet, is it not? The roads are clear. No bandits, no brigands." He leaned forward, his feline eyes glinting like cold steel. "Tell me, Herr Ambassador, what evidence do you have of these disappearances?" The man hesitated. "There are rumors. People speak of—" "Rumors," Valerius interrupted, laughing softly. "Rumors are the province of frightened peasants, and we would not want to alarm Baron Richter with superstition, would we?" The ambassador swallowed hard. His companions shifted uneasily. They knew what was happening, what had always happened in Sylvania's dark corners, but they were powerless to challenge him. Valerius rose from his throne, stepping down with slow, deliberate movements. The hem of his midnight black cloak whispered against the stone floor. "You and your men will stay the night," he declared, his voice brooking no argument. "The roads beyond my walls are treacherous after dark." The envoys paled further. They had no choice but to obey. A feast for the prince. The banquet that followed was a mockery of hospitality. A grand feast was laid out, the long tables adorned with silver goblets and platters of glistening meats. The Stirlanders ate cautiously, chewing in silence, while Valerius and his court watched them with predatory amusement. Goblin's wine was poured into goblets, an old Sylvanian vintage, thick and dark as clotted blood. The humans drank hesitantly, unaware that the wine was laced with sleeping drops. Then came the moment Valerius had been waiting for. The first envoy, a young man with auburn hair, slumped forward, his head hitting the table with a dull thud. Another groaned, his limbs seizing, his eyes rolling back. One by one, they collapsed. Valerius stood, dabbing the corner of his mouth with a black silk handkerchief. His soldiers moved swiftly, dragging the unconscious envoys from the hall. The last one, the leader, remained conscious. Fear and realization flooded his wide, glassy eyes. "What have you?" Valerius placed a finger against his lips. "Shh." Then, with inhuman speed, he lunged. His fangs sank into the envoy's throat, piercing skin, muscle, and vein. The man gave a strangled gasp as hot, copper-rich blood flooded Valerius's mouth, sliding down his throat in thick, delicious gulps. The heartbeat beneath his teeth stuttered, then slowed. He drank deeply, feeling the mortal's life unravel beneath his touch. He could see the man's memories as they faded into the abyss, his childhood in Stirland, his wife and son waiting for him, his futile hope that he would walk away from this place. Valerius pulled back, exhaling softly. The body slumped lifelessly in his arms, pale, empty, drained. He turned to his soldiers. "Take the rest to the dungeons," he commanded. "I may have use for them later." A kingdom of night. Later, as the moon rose higher, Valerius stood once more upon his balcony, gazing out over his domain. He could hear the distant howls of wolves, the shuffling of ghouls in the lower crypts. This was his kingdom. Not a mortal one, not one of laws and gold and politics, but of silence and shadow, of blood and death. The world outside still believed in order, in daylight, in justice. But Sylvania was a land where such things had died long ago, where the dead still walked, where monsters reigned. And he was its prince. A prince of the forgotten, the damned, the lost. The Prince of Midnight. Chapter 2. A Gathering of Night. The night air carried the scent of old blood and damp earth, the very essence of Sylvania's eternal decay. Valerius rode through the mist-choked forests atop his black destrier, the beast's hooves striking the ground like hammer blows. His cloak billowed behind him, woven from shadow and sorrow, a symbol of his dominion. Ahead, the ruins of Drakenhof castle loomed in the darkness, its towers jagged like broken fangs, its gates flanked by statues of faceless wraiths. A place of power, where the vampire courts gathered in secret when politics called for whispers rather than war. Tonight he would be granted his due, he was sure of it. The court of the undead. Within the great hall of Drakenhof, the vampire nobility had assembled. Black-armored figures stood in rigid silence, their glowing eyes peering from beneath shadowed hoods, their bodies still as corpses, yet filled with predatory menace. They sat in a half-circle around the obsidian throne, where their leader, Lord Valerius Von Carstein, awaited. Marek was an elder among their kind, his skin stretched tight over ancient bone, his eyes like shards of red ice. He wore a great fur-lined cloak, the silver trim embroidered with ancient runes of his bloodline. His fingers, long and talon-like, drummed against the armrest of his throne of blackened bone. Valerius strode forward, his own armor glinting in the dim torchlight, dark silver, engraved with curling filigree, the sigil of his house displayed proudly on his breastplate. He lowered his head in calculated deference, though his arrogance remained unveiled. "My lord," Valerius said smoothly, "you summoned me on a night of importance. I trust this gathering is to honor my recent conquests?" A ripple of amusement passed through the gathered lords, though it was laced with something colder. Lord Marek's expression did not change. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of centuries. "You overstep, Valerius." The word sent a creeping sense of unease through him. His fingers tensed at his sides. "I am loyal," Valerius countered. "I have kept our enemies at bay. The mortals cower in fear at my name, as they should." Marek tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Fear is a weapon, yes, but only in the hands of those who wield it wisely." He raised one bony hand, and a figure stepped forward from the shadows. "Baron Luthar." Valerius barely concealed his disgust. Luthar was a hateful wretch, a noble in title alone, his once proud form now bloated, his skin waxen with overindulgence in the blood of the unworthy. His yellowed teeth gleamed in the torchlight, a perpetual sneer twisting his lips. Luthar gave a mocking bow. "My lords, let us speak plainly. Valerius is a disease among us. Murmurs spread through the chamber. This ambitious whelp builds his strength in the borderlands, rallying thralls and ghouls, feasting upon the blood of Sylvanian nobles. Luthar spat. He dreams of wearing Drakenhof's crown, though he pretends otherwise. Valerius snarled, his fangs flashing. I serve this court. I serve our kind. I have defended our lands while you wallow in decay and cowardice. A sharp silence followed. Malik's eyes burned into him. You speak as though you are greater than your kin. Valerius stiffened. He had walked into a trap, and he knew it. The accusation, the tension in the air thickened, the torches casting elongated shadows upon the cold stone floor. Marik rose slowly, his skeletal fingers curling around the pommel of his blade, a relic from ages long past, forged in darkness, quenched in blood. You would break the balance of our kind, Malik said, his voice now an ominous whisper. You take too much, you act without permission, and you gather power, as though you mean to challenge us. A single word echoed through the chamber, soft yet absolute. Treason. Valerius's mind raced. He had anticipated this moment. His enemies would seek to strike before he grew too strong, but he had not expected them to move so soon. Luthar was smirking now, drunk on the triumph of his betrayal. You will kneel, Valerius, Malik continued. You will swear eternal fealty to the bloodline, forsaking all ambition. Or, the shadows in the hall shifted. Valerius heard them before he saw them. The motionless guards that had lined the walls were no longer still. They stepped forward as one, their red eyes burning behind their helmets. He had come to be rewarded, and instead he had been sentenced to death. A blade in the dark. Valerius did not hesitate. In a blur of motion he drew his sword, a wicked blackened blade etched with runes of the damned, and slashed the throat of the nearest guard. A fountain of blood erupted, thick and dark, painting the stone red. The room erupted into chaos. Luthar screamed, stumbling back as Valerius moved like a predator unleashed, his blade carving through the black-armored enforcers. Their bodies fell in twitching heaps, their lifeblood soaking the marble floor. Marik did not move. He simply watched. Valerius knew this was not a battle he could win, not here. His mind worked faster than lightning. He had to escape. A figure lunged at him, a towering knight clad in heavy plate. Valerius caught the attacker's wrist mid-strike, his unnatural strength shattering bone like dry wood. The knight screamed, but it was cut short as Valerius ripped out his throat with a single clawed hand, tossing the corpse aside. Then the torches were snuffed. Darkness. The magic of the elder vampires surged through the hall, choking the air with the weight of an ancient curse. Shadows clawed at Valerius, seeking to ensnare him, to drag him into the oblivion of undead. But Valerius was not so easily taken. He reached for the magic within himself, the blood-forged power of his ancestors, and with a whispered incantation, his form dissolved into mist. The tendrils of shadow grasped at nothing. A furious snarl rang out. Marik's voice, sharp as a blade. Find him. But Valerius was already gone, his spectral form slipping through the cracks in the ancient stone, escaping into the void beyond. A future forged in blood. He reformed in the wilds beyond Drakenhof, his breath ragged with fury. They had turned on him. They had tried to snuff him out before he could claim his birthright. His fingers curled into fists as he stared toward the horizon. If they would not let him rise as a prince, then he would return as something worse, something unstoppable, something that would make them beg for the mercy of death. Drakenhof had betrayed him, but Sylvania would be his, and before the end, he would drink deep of Marik's blood. Chapter 3. The Crimson Dagger. The cold night air carried the scent of damp stone and old blood. as Prince Valerius von Carstein moved through the winding forest paths, his breath curling in mist before him. He had fled Drakenhof, his mind a storm of fury and betrayal, but even now he knew his enemies would not let him simply vanish into the night. His armor was still slick with blood, his blade dulled from the slaughter of his would-be executioners. The betrayal at the vampire court had not merely been political maneuvering, it had been an outright purge. Marek had deemed him too dangerous to live. Valerius snarled under his breath. He had spent centuries building his dominion, gathering his strength, and what had it brought him? Betrayal, treachery. But he was not so easily broken. Then he felt it, the shift in the air, but a trickling sense of dread slithering down his spine. His steps slowed, and then a whisper of motion through the trees. Valerius barely had time to turn before the first arrow struck. It punched through his shoulder, the enchanted steel sizzling against his flesh. He hissed in pain, staggering back just as a second bolt tore through his side. Then, from the darkness, they came. The ambush. A dozen figures emerged from the gloom, clad in blackened armor, their eyes glowing crimson beneath their helmets. They moved with the silent grace of hunters, forming a tight noose around him. At their head stood Baron Luthar, his perpetual sneer curling his lips, his corpulent frame barely contained within his ornate black and silver armor. The filigree of his breastplate was freshly polished, an insult he had prepared for this, while Valerius had been on the run like an animal. Luthar's voice was thick with triumph. "Prince Valerius," he mocked, stepping forward, "it seems you've lost your way." Valerius clenched his jaw, ignoring the burning pain of the silver-tipped bolts embedded in his flesh. His eyes flicked to the warriors surrounding him, assessing them, searching for a weakness. "I should have known you would crawl out of the shadows." Valerius spat, his tone dripping with venom. Luthar's smirk widened. "Crawl? Oh no, I ascended. While you wasted your nights brooding in your forgotten little fortress, I was securing my place among the true masters of Sylvania." Valerius took a step forward, then staggered. Pain flared in his veins, white-hot and unbearable. He gritted his teeth, his fangs bared as his limbs trembled. The arrows. They weren't just silver. They had been coated in witchbane oil, a poison crafted to weaken creatures of the night, to make them slow, clumsy, vulnerable. Luthar tilted his head mockingly. "What's wrong, my lord? Feeling a little sluggish?" Valerius lunged, snarling, his blade cutting through the air. But before his strike could land, chains shot out from the darkness, wrapping around his arms, his neck, his legs. The moment the silver links touched his skin, agony surged through him, searing into his flesh like molten iron. Valerius roared in fury, his knees buckling as the strength bled from his limbs. He fell. The impact sent a shockwave of pain through his body, but he fought against it, clawing at the chains. Luthar crouched before him, gripping his ashen hair, yanking his head up to meet his gaze. "You've had your time in the dark, Valerius," Luthar whispered. "Now you'll see what it feels like to be hunted." Valerius spat blood in his face. Luthar's smile didn't waver. Instead, he wiped his cheek with leisurely amusement before pulling something from his belt. The dart. Its blade was forged from crimson steel, its edge blackened with ancient runes, pulsing with malefic energy. "The crimson dagger," Luthar mused, turning it in his grip. "A weapon forged in the fires of nagash. You know what makes it so special?" Valerius's vision swam, his body growing weaker by the second, but he forced himself to watch. Luthar leaned in, whispering, "It devours us." And then he plunged it into Valerius's chest. The blade of betrayal. The pain was indescribable. It wasn't just a wound. The dagger drank from him, pulling the very essence of his undead soul into its cursed steel. Valerius screamed, his flesh burning from within, his veins turning black with decay. Luthar twisted the blade. "You always thought yourself better than us," he hissed. "Always thought you were a prince, but you were nothing. Just another beast in the dark." Valerius clawed at the ground, his fingers curling into the dirt, his fangs bared in defiance. He wouldn't die here. Not like this. But the dagger drained him. He could feel his power bleeding away, his body weakening, his vision darkening. And then, blackness, the dungeons of the damned. Valerius awoke to unrelenting cold. His body was naked, his armor stripped from him. The silver chains were still wrapped around his wrists, his ankles, his throat, burning against his undead flesh, sapping what little strength remained. He was in a dungeon. The walls were wet with filth, the air thick with rot. From somewhere in the distance he heard something stir. Laughed Luthar. His voice echoed through the darkness, cruel and triumphant. "You will die here, Valerius," Luthar's voice purred. "But not yet. No, no, no. First I want to see you break." The sound of a rusted door creaking open filled the chamber. Heavy footsteps approached. Something large, something hungry. And then Luthar's final whisper. "Try not to scream too quickly." Then the beast lunged, and the world became pain. Chapter 4. The Curse of the Beast. Darkness. It surrounded Prince Valerius von Carstein, thick and suffocating, clinging to his skin like oil. He hung from enchanted silver chains, shackled to the damp stone walls of a forgotten dungeon deep beneath Drakenhof. His once proud form was reduced to a ruin, his flesh marred by burns and deep lacerations, the cursed wounds left by the crimson dagger refusing to heal. He had lost all concept of time. Days, weeks, months. It did not matter. Only the hunger remained. The chamber of unmaking. On the final night, they came for him. The heavy iron doors groaned open, spilling torchlight into his prison. Figures in dark robes entered, their faces hidden beneath black hoods, their skeletal hands clutching serrated blades and vials of black ichor. Among them stood Baron Luthar, his corpulent frame draped in finery. Valerius lifted his head, his fangs bared in defiance despite his weakened state. Luthar grinned. "Still clinging to your arrogance," he sneered. "You should be grateful, Valerius. We could have simply left you to rot, but our Lord has decreed that your punishment shall be more fitting." From the darkness, Lord Marek stepped forward. The ancient vampire's sunken eyes gleamed with malice, his withered lips curling into a joyless smile. He carried an iron chalice, its contents thick and pulsating, a concoction crafted from forbidden sorcery and twisted alchemy. Valerius did not need to ask what it was. He knew. A curse. A transformation beyond cruelty. Marek's voice was cold and methodical, his words slicing through the silence like a scalpel. "You have proven yourself too dangerous to kill, Valerius. Death would be too merciful." Luthar chuckled, his yellowed teeth flashing in the torchlight. "And mercy is something you shall never know again." The ritual begins. The cultist descended upon him, slicing open his wrists, his chest, his throat, letting his blood pour freely. His head was wrenched back, his mouth forced open as Marek tilted the chalice to his lips. The liquid slid down his throat, burning like magma, searing through his veins. Then came the pain. It started as fire, a slow and horrific bloom in his gut, spreading through his limbs. But fire would have been mercy. This was something else. His bones cracked, his flesh convulsed, his body rejecting itself. He screamed, his voice warping, turning into something inhuman. His claws tore against the stone, his back arched violently, his ribcage splitting open as something monstrous began to emerge. His mind shattered. His thoughts became scattered, his identity unraveling, replaced with something primal. Memories fled, replaced by a void of hunger and rage. He was no longer Valerius Von Carstein. He was a thing. A beast. A Vargulf. The horror unleashed. Luthar and the cultists stepped back as the creature that had once been Valerius lurched forward, its massive form collapsing onto all fours. Its skin was blackened with necrotic energy, its muscles swollen, its spine twisted into a monstrous hunch. Jagged bone protruded from its back, its hands ending in razor-sharp claws, its mouth a gaping maw filled with rows of serrated fangs. It screamed, a sound that shattered the torches, shook the stone, and rippled through the very fabric of the night. The cultists fell to their knees in horror. Luthar took a shaky step back, his sneer faltering for the first time. This is beyond expectation," he whispered. Merrick, however, simply smiled. "Perfect." Then he snapped his fingers. The guards rushed forward, their blades flashing in the dim light. The Vargulf did not hesitate. It exploded into motion, moving faster than the eye could track, its clawed hand tearing through the first guard's chest with inhuman strength, ripping his ribcage apart in a spray of gore. The second guard tried to retreat, but the Vargulf was already upon him, its massive jaws clamping down on his skull, crushing bone, brain, and blood into a pulped ruin. The third ran, but it was hopeless. The Vargulf pounced, driving him to the ground, its claws eviscerating him, leaving a shredded corpse twitching in a pool of viscera. The monster's fury. Luthar stumbled away, panic flaring in his eyes. "Control it," he barked at Merrick. Merrick only watched. The Vargulf turned its crimson gaze on Luthar, its breath hot and steaming, its jaws dripping with the gore of its victims. Somewhere, buried beneath the horror, something remained. A flicker of recognition, a whisper of vengeance. Luthar, the one who had orchestrated this, the one who had stolen everything. The Vargulf lunged. Luthar barely had time to raise his arms before the monstrous claws tore through his armor, ripping his flesh apart, sending chunks of meat and shattered bones spraying across the chamber. The Vargulf roared, lifting Luthar's broken body into the air. Screams filled the chamber, but just as it was about to tear Luthar's throat out, a shadow moved. Mid. His skeletal fingers twisted, and a dark spell surged forward, wrapping around the Vargulf like barbed chains. The beast shrieked, its limbs locking, its body contorted in agony as pure necromantic power crushed it into submission. Luthar gasped, clutching his ruined body as the monster was forced onto its knees. Merrick stepped closer. His voice was cold. "You are no longer Valerius Von Carstein. You are a curse. You are a beast." The Vargulf shook, snarling, thrashing against the magic, but it was too strong. Merrick turned to the remaining vampires. "Release it into the wilderness. Let it run. Let it rot. Let it become the monster it was always meant to be." And then the chains snapped. The beast fled into the night, its howl echoing through the ruins of Drakenhof, a cry that spoke of hunger, hatred, and the promise of vengeance to come. Chapter 5. The Hunt Begins. Born anew in blood and madness. The winds howled through the black forests of Sylvania, carrying the scent of rot and damp earth, of old blood spilled upon cursed soil. The beast moved through the undergrowth, its massive form blending with the shadows, its breath steaming in the frigid night air. It did not think, it did not plan. It existed, driven by an all-consuming hunger. The last remnants of Prince Valerius von Carstein had withered into nothingness beneath the weight of his transformation. He was the Vargulf now, a mindless apex predator, a ruin of what once had been a noble prince, his once regal features twisted into a grotesque mask of rage and bloodlust. His elongated claws dripped with viscera, his mangled fangs bared, his muscular, hunched body covered in a thick, matted hide of blackened flesh. His eyes, once filled with cold cunning, were now feral pits of crimson light, void of reason but ablaze with ceaseless wrath. The world had become a haze of motion, hunger, and slaughter, and the first to die would be the mortals who thought to end him. The hunters' folly. They had come in force, believing the beast weak, lost, broken. They were wrong. The witch hunters of Stirland, 20 strong, marched through the skeletal trees, their torches casting flickering light against the creeping fog. At their head rode Captain Reinhardt, a veteran of 100 hunts, his armor worn but well forged, his long coat stitched with wards of faith, his greatsword carved with the names of the vampires he had slain. He had come seeking the Prince of Midnight, expecting to find a crippled wretch, a cursed abomination, too broken to resist the cleansing flame. Instead, he found a nightmare given flesh. One moment the hunters moved in silence, their silver-tipped crossbows aimed toward the tree line. The next, the Vargulf came screaming out of the darkness, a towering blur of claws, fangs, and madness. The first hunter had no time to react. The beast ripped his head from his shoulders in a single swipe, his spinal cord trailing behind like a length of rope, his blood spraying across the others in thick, hot arcs. The hunters reeled, but the Vargulf was already among them. Slaughter in the fog. The hunter lunged with a silvered pike, but the Vargulf moved faster, its clawed hand punching through the man's chest, shattering ribs and gripping his still-beating heart. The hunter gasped, his eyes wide in horror. Then the beast crushed the organ in its fist, feeling the pulse fade into nothingness before tossing the corpse aside. A second hunter fired a silver bolt, the projectile embedding itself in the beast's side. It snarled, more enraged than wounded, its blood hissing like acid where the metal struck. It lunged, grabbing the attacker by the throat and slamming him into the ground with bone-making force. Before the man could scream, the Vargulf's jaws found his belly, tearing through his leather jerkin and into his soft, quivering entrails. The sound of ripping flesh and splintering bone filled the air as the beast feasted, tearing away chunks of meat with ravenous abandon. The remaining hunters turned to flee. It did not matter. They were prey now, and prey did not escape the hunter. The fall of Captain Reinhardt. Captain Reinhardt had seen monsters beyond count, but nothing like this. This was not a vampire, not a creature of intelligence and cruel cunning. This was pure, undiluted savagery, a force of nature, a thing beyond fear, beyond reason. He spurred his horse, charging the beast, his blade raised high, his faith burning away his terror. "For Sigmar's light!" he roared. The Vargulf turned, its eyes locking onto him, its face twisted into a grotesque, bloody grin. Then it moved with inhuman speed. Before Reinhardt's blade could strike, the beast's massive hand lashed out, tearing the warhorse's legs from beneath it in a spray of crimson. The beast roared, snarling, as its rider was sent tumbling to the ground, his sword clattering from his grasp. Reinhardt tried to rise, but a clawed foot crashed down onto his chest, pinning him with unholy strength. He looked up into the creature's face, and for the first time, he felt true, overwhelming horror. This was no mindless monster. This was something that remembered. Somewhere, buried beneath the beast's rage, was Valerius Von Carstein, and he wanted revenge. The Vargulf's jaws unhinged, descending upon Reinhardt's throat. The captain screamed as the fangs sank deep, his windpipe torn free in a single, brutal motion. Blood gushed, hot and thick, splattering against the Vargulf's face as it tore and gorged, ripping away sinew and cartilage, reducing the captain's once proud form into little more than a ruined husk of meat and broken armor. The blood-drenched dawn. By the time the sun threatened the horizon, the massacre was complete. 20 hunters had entered the woods. None had survived. The Vargolf stood atop a mound of mutilated corpses, its blackened claws slick with the blood of its victims, its fangs still gnashing at the air, its body trembling with the aftershocks of the kill. But something was different now. The haze of pure instinct had lessened, just slightly, like a distant whisper trying to pierce the fog. It did not understand why. It only knew one thing. More would come, and when they did, they would die screaming. Chapter 6. Whispers of Nagash. The faint echo of Valerius. The night had grown still. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of cooling blood sliding from the jagged claws of the Vargolf, pooling around the broken bodies of the men it had slaughtered. The massacre was done. The hunger had been sated. And yet something felt wrong. The Vargolf's monstrous frame heaved with slow, labored breaths, its massive limbs trembling as it stood over the ruin it had created. The corpses of the Stirland hunters lay in pieces, their flesh torn open, organs spilled like offal from a butcher's table. Their weapons, useless charms of silver and steel, were scattered in the mud, already forgotten. But the beast did not immediately move on to the next hunt. It hesitated. Something was scraping against the inside of its mind, a dull ache of memory, a thing that should have long since faded. It tried to push it away. The Vargolf did not need memories. It did not need thoughts. It was hunger. It was rage. It was death given form. But still, the whisper came. A name it had not known for how long. Valerius. The red haze that had clouded its vision faltered. If only for a moment. I am Valerius. It was an alien thought, struggling against the weight of its bestial instincts. Something was wrong. Something was broken. And then a new sound, carried on the wind. A voice, feminine, soft, yet cold as the grave. "You do remember," it whispered, a voice like dust swirling through the catacombs. The Vargolf snarled, its massive hunched body twisting as it turned toward the sound. Its blackened claws scraped the dirt, its fangs bared in a savage snarl. But something in the air made it hesitate. From the mist a figure stepped forward. Seer Arana, the prophetess of dust. She was tall, draped in tattered robes of black and gray, the fabrics rotted in places, revealing dried, paper-thin flesh beneath. Her face was a death mask, eyes sunken but burning with unnatural light, and her hands were withered, skeletal things adorned with rings carved with symbols of Nagash, the great necromancer. She did not flinch before the Vargolf's monstrous presence. She studied it, her eyeless sockets empty but filled with knowledge. "You are not what you were meant to be," she intoned, "but you can be whole again." The Vargolf growled, its muscles tensing. It should kill her, tear her apart, rip the marrow from her bones. But it did not, because her words rang with something deep inside it, an echo of something lost. "Your name," Arana whispered, stepping closer. "Say it." The beast snarled, but there was hesitation in the sound. Arana extended one bony hand. Her fingernails were blackened, her skin tight like dried parchment stretched over ancient bone. In her palm lay a small shard of obsidian, pulsing faintly with a dark glow. "You have been cursed, Valerius Von Carstein," she continued, her voice slow, methodical. "Your soul is not whole, but there is a way to mend it, a way to reclaim your mind." The Vargolf's crimson eyes flicked toward the shard. It didn't understand what it was seeing, but something in the depths of its ruined consciousness recognized it. Something deep, ancient, powerful. A whisper curled around its thoughts, creeping into its mind like a disease. Nagash. The name struck like a blade. Nagash, the supreme lord of undeath, the usurper of mortality, the first lich. His presence was everywhere in Sylvania, in the soil, in the bones beneath the earth, in the very air that the dead did not breathe. But this was not merely memory. This was his voice, the curse and the bargain. The Vargulf recoiled, but the whispers did not stop. "Listen," Adorno murmured, "he speaks." A low hum filled the air, growing in intensity, like a great tide of darkness rising from the abyss. The Vargulf clutched its head, a howl of agony ripping from its throat as visions exploded behind its eyes. It saw a great black pyramid, wreathed in swirling death energy, rising above a ruined city of the dead. 1,000 skeletal hands, reaching from the void, clawing toward an unseen god. A figure clad in tattered robes of darkness, his face obscured, his voice a whisper that could snuff out suns. "You are not yet lost." The Vargulf gasped, the sound coming as a guttural, animalistic rasp. "Nagash." The great necromancer had turned his gaze upon him. Uranus smiled. "He offers you a path." The Vargulf snarled, shaking its monstrous head, trying to drive out the insidious voice, but it could feel it burrowing deeper. "You were meant for more than this," Urana continued. "You were not meant to be a beast, an animal, a mistake." The beast's massive claws scraped the dirt. Valerius. It knew the name. It knew itself. But the hunger still gnawed at its mind. The beast was still there, buried beneath the weight of the curse, waiting for its moment to seize control once more. "You will never be what you once were," Urana whispered. "But you can be something greater." The Vargulf did not move, but its eyes had changed. Something was returning. Something more than just instinct. Urana turned, gesturing toward the dark forests beyond. "There are 5 relics scattered across the ruins of Sylvania, artifacts tied to the first of your kind, remnants of the ancient Strigoi kings. With them, you can bind your fragmented soul, reforge your mind into something stronger than before." The Vargulf did not speak, but it understood. It did not trust the necromancer, but it felt the pull of something greater, a chance, no matter how twisted, to reclaim its will. Urana stepped back into the shadows, her voice fading like a sigh in the wind. "Find them, Valerius," she murmured, "or remain the beast forever." Then she was gone, and the Vargulf stood in silence, staring into the night. It did not know if it would ever be free. But it knew one thing. It would hunt, and this time it would not hunt as a beast. It would haunt as something more. Chapter 7. The hunger within. The hunger was endless. It gnawed at him, an insatiable, writhing thing, twisting like a nest of serpents in his gut. No amount of flesh, no river of blood, no torn throat or shattered ribcage could satisfy it. The moment his fangs left the corpse, the craving began anew, worse than before. The Vargulf prowled the ruins of an ancient Sylvanian graveyard, its monstrous frame hunched and twitching, its clawed hands dragging through the cold earth. It had fed. The carcasses of 3 men lay sprawled beneath the rotted husks of headstones, their bodies ripped apart, their bones cracked open for the marrow, their entrails spilled across the tombstones like an obscene offering. It should have been enough. But it was never enough. The beast's great muscular limbs trembled, and a low, ragged snarl escaped its throat. Blood dripped from its jaws, thick and black, but it did nothing to soothe the fire clawing at its mind. Somewhere, in the deep recesses of its consciousness, a faint whisper stirred. A voice, a name. Valerius. The Vargulf convulsed, thrashing, its massive talons raking deep gouges into the stone as waves of pain and fury surged through its mind. It did not want to remember. It did not want to think. Thinking was pain. Thinking was loss, was weakness, was betrayal. Thinking was the past. And the beast had no past. Only hunger. The struggle for control. The sky above was a churning sea of dark clouds, the moon swallowed by shadows, casting the landscape into pure Stygian blackness. The wind carried the scent of death and decay, a lullaby of the Deadlands. The Vargulf staggered, clutching its skull with its monstrous claws, letting out a howl of torment that sent the carrion birds spiraling from the treetops. Something was pressing against it, inside it, fighting to claw its way free from the depths of the abyss. It growled, low, guttural, dangerous, trying to shake it off. But the more it fought, the stronger the presence became. Visions of the past. A sudden, blinding pain lanced through the Vargul's skull, and then the world shattered. A flood of memories crashed against the walls of its mind, hammering at its consciousness like a tide of burning knives. A black throne, its edges engraved with the sigil of Von Carstein, bathed in the dim glow of candlelight. A wine goblet filled with thick crimson blood, the taste of warm iron on his lips. A woman's laughter, soft and cruel, whispering promises of power and eternity. Drakenhof Castle, its towers looming like the bones of a dead god, its halls filled with laughter and malice. A dagger of cursed crimson steel, piercing his chest, stealing away his flesh and soul alike. The agonizing rebirth, his body warping, twisting, becoming this thing, this monster, this wretched, ravenous beast. The memories were knives cutting through the fog, tearing into him, forcing him to remember. The Vargulf fell to its knees, its massive frame convulsing, its breath ragged and uneven. It roared, the sound shaking the earth, a scream of pure agony, of defiance, of hatred. It did not want to be Valerius. It wanted to be nothing. The beast fights back. The hunger surged again, desperate to reclaim control. It whispered, seduced, promised. There is no need for memories. There is no need for pain. There is only hunger. There is only blood. The beast lunged forward, digging its fangs into the corpse of one of the dead hunters, ripping into the flesh, trying to drown out the thoughts, to silence the past beneath raw, primal gluttony. Torn flesh slid down its throat. It tasted nothing. It did not soothe the burning need within him. It did not quiet the voices. The Vargulf wrenched itself away, its claws tearing at its own body, carving deep gouges into its chest and shoulders, trying to drive the memories out, to bleed them from its veins. Blood poured, but it did not stop the whispers. The beast roared, ripping at its own flesh, but Valerius did not fade away. He was still there, a ghost inside the monster, a presence that would not be devoured. And for the first time since his transformation, the Vargulf hesitated. The moment of choice. The night air was thick with tension, the very land itself holding its breath. The Vargulf stood frozen, caught between what it had become and what it had once been. Two paths stretched before it. To give in, to surrender fully to the hunger, to let the past die, to become nothing more than a beast of the night, an animal of pure instinct, lost forever. To fight, to claw its way back from the abyss. To forge something new, something monstrous yet sentient, to reclaim not its old self, but something greater. The Vargul's crimson eyes burned, its body quivering, caught in a war that no steel could resolve. It could not go back, but it could move forward. The wind howled. The hunger screamed. The Vargulf turned away from the corpses, and for the first time since its fall from grace, it did not feed. Instead, it ran into the night, not as an animal, but as something that had yet to be defined, something that would soon become legend. Chapter 8. A Pact with the Damned. The Call of the Dead. The night was thick with unnatural silence, the kind that settled over cursed lands where even the wind feared to stir. The Vargulf, the beast that had once been Prince Valerius Von Carstein, moved through the blackened ruins of an ancient temple, its monstrous form barely making a sound as it stalked between the crumbling pillars and shattered statues of long-forgotten gods. The air was heavy with decay, thick with the stench of old blood and forgotten souls. Somewhere in the distance, a corpse lantern burned, a ghostly blue flame flickering atop a rusted iron sconce, its light barely reaching through the dense fog. And then, a whisper in the dark. "You came." The Vargulf halted, its crimson eyes flashing in the gloom. From the shadows, Sylvania stepped forward, her skeletal hands clutching a staff carved from blackened bone, the symbol of nagash engraved upon its surface. She was draped in robes that seemed more shadow than cloth, her withered form barely held together by dark sorcery and faith in death itself. Her skin was taut and sickly, her eyeless sockets burning with necromantic power, her very presence reeking of undeath. And yet, despite her frailty, there was no fear in her. She looked upon the beast before her, this towering horror of claw and sinew, and she smiled. "You still fight it," she whispered, stepping closer. The Vargulf growled, its massive claws digging into the stone, but it did not attack. Something about her called to it, not as prey, but as something else. The bargain. Arana circled him like a vulture around a dying beast, her voice low and knowing. "You feel it, don't you?" she murmured. "The war inside you, the hunger, the rage, but beneath it, the whispers of what you were, a battle you cannot win." The Vargul's breath came ragged, a guttural snarl rumbling from its throat. Arana tilted her head, the ghost of a smirk upon her withered lips. "But what if I told you it does not have to be a battle at all?" The beast froze, its claws twitching, the words slipping past its defenses like poisoned needles. "You were made into this," she continued. "A curse cast upon you, an affliction of the flesh. But it is not the first time such a thing has been done to our kind." She turned, lifting her staff, and from the air darkness coiled, revealing a vision, a memory not of Valerius, but of something ancient, something primal. The mist parted, and in its place a great throne of obsidian rose from the black sands of lost Nihekara. Atop it sat a figure, tall, monstrous, regal in his horror. Usherin, the first of the Strigoi kings, the flesh lord, the one who had once been a noble prince but had been betrayed and twisted into a monster by his own kin. The Vargul snarled at the image, recognizing something of itself within the forgotten king. "He's like you," Arana whispered, "betrayed, cast into the dark, turned into something lesser." The vision shifted. Usherin, kneeling before an altar, his clawed hands gripping a pulsing, blackened heart, his fangs bared as dark power surged through him. "But he did not let the curse consume him," Arana continued. "He took control of it. He forged himself into something new, something greater, and he did it with the power of a single artifact." The vision faded, leaving only darkness and the weight of Arana's words. "The heart of Usherin still exists," she said softly, "a relic of the first flesh-eater king, hidden away, pulsing with power and memory. If you claim it, you will not be as you were, but you will no longer be this mindless thing." The Vargul shuddered, its claws scraping against the stone. "Such not to be Valerius again, that was gone, stolen, crushed beneath the weight of this new form, but to be something else, something that was not just hunger and madness. It lifted its head, staring down at the necromancer, its crimson eyes burning with something more than primal fury now. Irana's smile widened. "You must go to the crypt of Morcaine," she said, her voice taking on the weight of prophecy. "Beneath the ruins of the first Strigoi stronghold, the heart still beats, waiting for one who can claim it. But it is not unguarded. The dead still wander there, bound to their hunger, and worse things lurk in the deep places of the world." She stepped closer, her bony fingers brushing the beast's massive arm, and for a brief moment the weight of her sorcery pressed against it. "You are no longer welcome in the courts of the night," she whispered, "but if you take the heart, you will forge a new path, a new throne, a new dominion." The Vargul's breathing slowed, its massive chest rising and falling, the embers of something old and terrible flickering behind its crimson gaze. Not human, not vampire, something beyond both, a new breed of monster, a prince of the forgotten. Irana stepped back, watching as the beast turned, facing the wilderness once more. "You must move quickly," she warned. "The dead are not the only ones who seek the heart. Others have heard its call. If they reach it before you—" She let the words linger, unspoken. The Vargulf did not hesitate. It turned and vanished into the mist, its massive form slipping into the night, heading toward Morcaine, toward the ruin of the old world, toward the relic that would decide its fate. Irana watched it go, her eyeless gaze following the beast. And then, in the stillness, she murmured to herself, or perhaps to something unseen. "Is not the first," she whispered, "but he may be the last." She turned away, the shadows consuming her form, and in the night, the whispers of Nagash followed after the fallen prince. Chapter 9. The First Revenge. The moon rises on a night of blood. The Vargulf crouched in the shadows, waiting, watching, his massive form hidden among the twisted, gnarled roots of the black trees of Sylvania. Above him, the pale moon was choked in clouds, its sickly light barely piercing the ever-present mist that clung to the land. Ahead, beyond the veil of fog, stood Castle Riefengast, a decrepit fortress belonging to Baron Eduard von Richter, one of Valerius' old rivals and a sworn ally of Luthar. The castle gates yawned open, torches flickering along the crumbling walls, illuminating the procession of undead knights, mortal thralls, and pale-faced courtiers, all gathered for a feast of blood and suffering. The air was thick with death, with decadence, with the sickly sweet stench of drained corpses piled carelessly along the walls. These were his kin, those who had cast him out, those who had laughed as he was bound in chains, those who had whispered in mockery as the ritual consumed him. But tonight they would scream his name in fear. Tonight they would know what it meant to betray Valerius Von Carstein. The Feast of the Damned. Inside the great hall, Baron Eduard reclined upon his throne, clad in crimson robes lined with golden embroidery, his fingers adorned with rings of necromantic power. His pale lips curled in amusement as his guests drank deep from the veins of still-living mortals, their agonized whimpers mixing with the sound of clinking goblets and cruel laughter. The noble vampires feasted, as they always had, their opulence a mockery of life, their hunger an endless abyss that no banquet could ever fill. Edouard lifted his chalice, filled with the blood of a young nobleman, his eyes gleaming with cruel delight. "To Baron Luthar," he declared, "who has rid us of a tiresome pest. May his hunting hounds tear out what little remains of Valerius von Carstein." Laughter rippled through the hall, echoing off the vaulted ceilings, shaking the iron chandeliers above. Then the torches flickered. A sudden gust of icy wind howled through the chamber, snuffing out the flames, plunging the revelers into shifting darkness. The laughter died. A moment of uneasy silence fell. Edouard's smirk faltered. A scream. The beast unleashed. A body crashed through the stained glass windows, landing in the middle of the banquet table with a sickening crunch. Blood splattered across the feast, pooling in goblets, soaking into fine silken velvet. The vampires jerked back in shock, fangs bared, eyes glowing in the gloom. One of Edward's knights, his body torn open from chest to groin, his ribs split apart like the cage of a butchered animal, his organs spilling onto the table. And then, from the shattered window, it came. The Vargulf crashed into the hall like a force of nature, its massive, hunched form looming over the gathered nobles, its red eyes burning with raw hatred, its fangs dripping with fresh gore. It roared, a sound so deep and terrible that it shook the very stones of the keep, sending plates and goblets shattering to the floor. The feast became a slaughter. The Vargulf moved in a blur of monstrous speed, claws flashing, fangs tearing, its raw ferocity ripping through the courtiers like a reaper through wheat. A noblewoman tried to run, but the beast seized her by the spine, lifting her into the air as she screamed, before biting her in half, showering the floor in her blood and entrails. The knight lunged, blade drawn, but the Vargulf caught the sword in its clawed hand, shattering the steel like glass, before tearing the knight's throat out with its teeth. A third vampire leaped onto the beast's back, driving a dagger into its shoulder, but it didn't slow. It snapped backward, jaws wide, and bit clean through the attacker's skull, splitting it like overripe fruit. The noble vampires screamed, their centuries of power and arrogance meaning nothing against the sheer, relentless brutality of the monster before them. Baron Edward's last stand. Edouard staggered backward, his face pale with disbelief as he watched his kin torn apart in seconds. "No," he gasped, eyes wide. This is impossible." The Vargulf turned its crimson gaze upon him, its jaws dripping with viscera, its massive body heaving with rage and hunger. Edward raised his hands, chanting a spell of banishment, trying to force the beast back with dark sorcery. The Vargulf lunged. It crossed the distance in a blink, slamming into Edward with bone-shattering force, sending the Baron crashing through his throne, wood and stone exploding around them. Edward gasped in pain, his ribs shattered, his lungs filling with blood. The Vargulf stood over him, drool and blood dripping from its jaws, its massive claws pressing down on his chest, crushing him slowly. You remember," Edward wheezed, his vision darkening. A low, guttural growl came from the beast. It did not nod, it did not speak. But the truth was in its eyes. It remembered everything. Edward opened his mouth to beg. The Vargulf bit down, ripping his head from his shoulders in a spray of blood. The Baron's body convulsed, then fell limp, his lifeless eyes staring into the void. And then the beast lifted the severed head high, letting out a howl that shook the castle to its foundations. The few remaining nobles fled into the night, their minds broken with fear, whispering a name that had been meant to die in chains. Valerius Von Carstein, the Prince of Midnight, had returned, and his vengeance had only begun. Chapter 10. The Price of Power. The Aftermath of Vengeance. The moon hung low over the ruin of Castle Riefengast, its pale light washing over the carnage left in the wake of Valerius's return. The once proud fortress had become a tomb of broken bodies and splattered gore, its banquet hall drowned in the blood of noble vampires. Their once immortal forms lay in ruin, their ornate garments torn and soaked in viscera, their final expressions frozen in agony. And at the center of it all, the Vargulf stood, its massive chest rising and falling, its clawed hands still slick with warm blood, its monstrous form towering over the remnants of his old world. It had fed, but the hunger remained. It had killed, but the rage still burned. Because this was not enough, The whispering dark. A low wind howled through the shattered windows, stirring the tattered banners that once bore the sigil of Baron Eduard von Richter. Then, amidst the silence of the dead, a voice slithered through the shadows. "You revel in slaughter, but what have you truly won?" The Vargulf's head snapped toward the darkness, fangs bared, crimson eyes burning, ready to strike. From the depths of the ruined chamber, a figure emerged, cloaked in flowing black, her skeletal frame wrapped in tattered silk, her eyeless sockets glowing with pale fire. Seer Arana. She had foreseen this moment, as she had foreseen all others. "You have made them fear you," she said, stepping closer, her feet barely disturbing the blood pooling at her feet. "You have reminded them that you are no easy prey. But what now, my prince?" The Vargulf growled, its massive claws twitching, but it did not attack. "Not yet." "You feel it," Arana whispered, tilting her withered head. "The hunger that will never fade. The rage that will never still. Do you think slaughter alone will make you whole?" The beast snarled, its muscles coiling, its fangs glinting in the moonlight. "You are still bound by the chains they placed upon you," Arana continued, unafraid. "You still belong to the curse. You are not yet master of your own fate." A long, heavy silence settled between them. Then, at last, the beast spoke. A voice not fully human nor fully beast. A guttural, hollow growl that rattled with something ancient. "How? The 5 relics of the first night." Arana smiled, the expression more a skeletal grimace than anything human. "You must find the 5 relics of the first night," she intoned, her voice taking on the weight of prophecy. "Long ago, in the age before your kind became fractured, before the first Strigoi were exiled and cursed, there were artifacts of power, relics that carried the essence of the first blood. They were forged in darkness, steeped in the knowledge of Usherin, the Flesh Lord, and bound to the will of the night itself. You can reshape what you have become. You will not be Valerius as he once was, nor will you remain a mindless beast. You will become something new, something greater." The Vargul's monstrous form shifted, its clawed fingers tightening into fists. "Where," it rumbled, its voice like distant thunder, "do I find them?" Arana stepped forward, lifting her bony hand, and from the air itself shadows swirled, forming the image of 5 ancient relics. The 5 relics of the first night. The ring of Zathathar, a ring of blackened bone, once worn by Usherin's most trusted warlord, buried deep beneath the ruins of Morcaine, where the dead still linger. The talon of Usherin, the clawed hand of a fallen Strigoi king, preserved in a necromantic stasis of blood and shadow, locked away in the cursed vaults of Drakenhof, the very place of Valerius' betrayal. The crown of the forgotten prince, a cursed diadem stolen from Usherin's body after his fall, its power still dormant beneath the crypts of Morcaine, guarded by those who still remember the old ways. The veil of night, a tattered spectral cloak, said to grant the wearer the ability to move between worlds, stepping through the veil of death itself. It is hidden within the catacombs of nagash, a place few dare to tread. The heart of Usherin, the most powerful artifact of all, the still-beating heart of the first flesh-eater, removed before his destruction, its pulsing core filled with power beyond understanding. It is buried beneath the ruins of the first Strigoi court, beneath a city long since devoured by time. As the Vargul stared at the swirling visions, something stirred inside it. A flicker of recognition, of purpose, a path forward. It would never return to what it once was, but it could become something else, something worthy of the fear his name now carried. The price of power. Arana closed her hand, and the visions vanished into darkness. "The path will be long," she murmured, "and the price will be steep." The Vargulf growled, stepping forward, towering over her. It did not ask what the price was. It did not care. Arana reached into her robes, withdrawing a shard of blackened stone, pulsing faintly with necrotic energy. "Then begin your path with this," she whispered. "The first key to Marcaine." The Vargulf reached out, its massive, clawed hand enveloping the relic, and the moment it touched its flesh, pain, fire, memory, visions rushed through its mind, a howling storm of screams and death, of ancient ruins filled with restless dead, of monsters waiting beneath the earth, whispering of the old world. And through it all, the heartbeats. The heart of Usherin still pulsed, still called. Valerius threw back his head and howled, the sound splitting the night, a cry that shook the very foundations of the land. The hunt had begun, and soon he would claim what was his. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11. The Crypt of the Ghoul King. The Descent into Darkness. The sky above Sylvania was black and rotten, choked by clouds that smothered the moon in an eternal shroud of twilight. The land below festered, a graveyard of forgotten ages where things long dead still stirred in the cold soil. Deep within the heart of this cursed land, beneath the crumbling ruins of Marcaine, lay the Crypt of the Ghoul King, a labyrinthine necropolis where the dead did not sleep, where horrors that should not exist still feasted on rotting marrow and the memories of a forgotten empire. It was here that Valerius, the Vargulf, the fallen prince, the beast that walked like a man, had come. For the first relic of the first night was buried in this tomb of foul things and crawling nightmares. The Ring of Zatar, a relic of an age when the Strigoi were lords, not beasts, when Usherin's warlords had walked as kings over a kingdom of the damned. But now it lay deep within the crypt, guarded by a creature more monstrous than even Valerius himself. The entrance to the necropolis. The Vargulf stood before the yawning entrance, a gaping wound in the land where ancient stone steps descended into blackness, the stench of rotting flesh and old death curling from the depths like a diseased breath, a warning to those who still possessed fear. Valerius had no such weakness. He moved forward, his monstrous bulk slipping into the darkness, his massive clawed hands scraping against the stone as he crept downward. The walls were covered in the remains of old battles, bones gnawed clean, carvings defaced, sigils of the Strigoi kings desecrated by those who had long since forgotten their meaning. And yet, even now, the dead things below whispered of their old masters. They still hungered. The thralls of the Ghoul King. The first attack came without warning. A dozen pairs of glowing yellow eyes snapped open in the dark. Then, a skittering sound. Pale, emaciated shapes emerged from the crypt walls, clawed hands and jagged teeth gleaming in the dim torchlight, their hunched forms covered in filth, their eyes burning with endless rabid hunger. Those, the twisted remnants of men, descendants of those who had once feasted at the tables of vampires, now nothing more than wretched carrion feeders, their minds shattered by centuries of cannibalism and undeath. They came in a frenzied swarm, their claws raking against the stone, their mouths gibbering mindless prayers to their unseen king. Valerius did not retreat. He lunged. His massive claws split the first ghoul in two, its spine snapping like brittle wood, blackened blood gushing onto the cold stone floor. A second leapt onto his back, shrieking, jagged nails tearing into his flesh. But the Vargulf reached back, seized it by the throat and crushed its windpipe with a single flex of his monstrous grip. A third managed to sink its rotting teeth into his forearm, only for Valerius to slam its head into the wall again and again until there was nothing left but a mangled ruin of shattered bone and pulped flesh. The remaining ghouls hesitated. Valerius turned toward them, his crimson eyes flaring, his lips curling back over dagger-like fangs, his massive chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate menace. He did not snarl. He did not charge. He simply watched them, and they understood. They were not the hunters here. They were prey. With low, guttural whimpers, the ghouls scattered into the darkness, fleeing down the twisting tunnels, yipping like whipped dogs. Valerius let them run, because he was not here for them. He was here for their king, the Ghoul King's throne. At the heart of the necropolis, beneath a ceiling of dripping stalactites, the Ghoul King sat upon his throne of bones. He was huge, even by ghoul standards, his muscular, hunched body covered in patches of gray, peeling flesh, his long claws blackened with centuries of filth and dried blood. His red eyes gleamed with more than just hunger. There was cunning there, a vestige of a once noble mind, warped by endless years in the dark. Atop his rotting, hairless head, he wore a crown of cracked bone, and upon his right hand, a single ring gleamed black as midnight, the ring of Zathar. Valerius stepped forward. The Ghoul King's lips peeled back into a wide, unnatural grin, exposing a mouth filled with jagged, needle-like fangs. "You stink of our blood, outsider," the creature hissed, his voice a mixture of malice and mockery. "And yet you are twisted. Not one of them, not one of us. You are wrong." The Vargulf growled, his massive frame tensing, ready to strike. The Ghoul King's grin widened. "Then come, cursed one." The battle of beasts. The Ghoul King moved like a blur, far faster than his bloated form should allow, leaping from his throne with a shriek, his claws swiping out with deadly precision. The first strike raked across Valerius' chest, tearing deep, jagged wounds, but he did not flinch. He caught the next attack, his massive claws gripping the Ghoul King's wrist, and with a sickening crack, he snapped the bone in half. The Ghoul King screamed, but his wounds did not slow him. He lunged again, sinking his jagged fangs into Valerius's shoulder, tearing into muscle and sinew. Valerius roared, not in pain, but in fury. He sank his own fangs into the Ghoul King's throat, biting down with monstrous strength, his teeth piercing flesh, cartilage, and veins, his jaws clamping down like a steel trap. The Ghoul King thrashed, but Valerius did not release him. With a snarl of pure dominance, he ripped his rival's throat out, tearing away flesh and windpipe in a spray of blackened blood. The Ghoul King staggered, gasping, clutching at the ruin of his neck, his eyes wide with disbelief. He tried to speak, to curse, to beg, to scream, but only a wet gurgle escaped his lips before he collapsed onto the blood-soaked stones. Valerius stood over the cooling corpse, black blood dripping from his fangs, then reached down and tore the ring of Zathar from the dead king's finger. A surge of dark power coursed through him, cold as the grave. He could feel it, whispering, guiding. One relic claimed. 4 more to go. Chapter 12. An Empire of Ash. The Whisper of Fear. The land of Sylvania was shifting. The name of Valerius Von Carstein, once whispered in mockery among the courts of the damned, now curdled on the tongues of the fearful. The dead spoke of his return. The ghouls whispered of a prince who walked among them, yet was not one of them. The lesser vampires, those who once served Luthar and Merrick, now hid in their decrepit halls, praying their treacheries would be forgotten. But Valerius had not forgotten. He left a trail of slaughter, his vengeance carving through the underbelly of Sylvania like a plague of fangs and claws. And soon his legend reached beyond the land of the dead. The hunters gather. Far from the tainted forests of Sylvania, across the borders of Stirland, a meeting was held in a fortress of iron and stone. The Order of the Blackened Sun, a sect of the Templars of Sigmar, had gathered beneath the dim glow of candlelight, their hands resting upon silvered blades and blessed stakes, their expressions grim and resolute. At their head stood Captain Reinhardt. The veteran hunter, a man forged in the fires of war, stood before them, his armor scarred from decades of battle, his eyes hardened from years of hunting the undead. He gripped the silver pommel of his greatsword, its runes of warding still stained with old blood, and turned to his men. "Valerius Von Carstein lives." The words hung in the air like a curse, each syllable heavy with dark omens. The noble houses of Sylvania believed him dead, lost to his own monstrous hunger, condemned to wander the wilds like an animal. But they were wrong. He turned, motioning to the scout who had delivered the report. The man's face was pale, his hands shaking, as though he had seen the abyss itself. "Tell them what you saw." The scout swallowed. I rode near the ruins of Riefengast," he stammered. "The castle was desecrated, bodies everywhere, torn apart, ripped open, their ribs cracked like kindling, their heads split in two. I found one survivor, one of the Baron's knights." The scout hesitated. Captain Reinhardt's gaze hardened. "Bent?" The scout exhaled shakily. G said. "It was him," he said. "Valerius came for them, that he wasn't a vampire anymore, that he was something worse." A murmur of unease rippled through the gathered Templars, their hands tightening on their weapons. Reinhard said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned to his men, eyes burning with purpose. "We ride for Sylvania," he said coldly. "We end this monster before his empire of ash consumes us all." The hunt begins. By the time the witch hunters crossed into Sylvania, they rode with fire and silver, their numbers bolstered by mercenary free companies and zealots from the Empire. They knew what they hunted was not a normal vampire. They had faced blood drinkers before, knew their tricks, their weaknesses, their arrogance. But this was something different. The first signs of Valerius' passage were found along the outskirts of the Mortehaven woodlands, where a village had been slaughtered to the last soul. Not by feral ghouls, not by thralls of some Sylvanian noble. By him. The witch hunters stood amid the ruins, their boots crunching over scorched remains, their torches flickering in the eerie stillness. Captain Reinhardt knelt beside a half-burned corpse, his gauntleted fingers brushing the remains of a child's skull, the bones shattered as if crushed by an iron grip. The priest beside him made the sign of Sigmar, murmuring a prayer for the dead. Reinhardt only scowled. This was no feeding frenzy, he muttered. One of his lieutenants, a hardened soldier named Marcus Velt, frowned. Then what was it? Reinhardt looked toward the shattered walls, the burned-out homes, the symbols scratched into the charred wood of the village hall, a twisted sigil painted in blood and ash. A mark of vengeance. "He's making a statement," Reinhardt said. His voice was grim, certain. "He's telling us he's back." A warning in blood. That night, as the hunters made camp, they took turns watching the tree line, torches burning bright to ward off the creatures that lurked in the mist. But it did not matter, because he was already among them. The attack came with no warning. A shadow moved through the trees, and then screams, blood, flesh ripping like parchment. The first to fall never even saw what killed him. One moment he was standing by the fire, and the next, a clawed hand burst through his chest, fingers curled around his still-beating heart. The camp exploded into chaos. Figures scrambled for their weapons, turning toward the monstrous blur of motion, their blades flashing in the torchlight. But Valerius was already among them. He moved with terrifying speed, his massive form crashing through the armored ranks like a war beast unleashed, his claws raking through steel and flesh alike. A hunter swung a silvered axe, but the Vargulf caught it mid-swing, snapping the shaft like a twig, before tearing the man's throat out in a single savage bite. Another hunter raised a blessed pistol, but before he could fire, Valerius' claws punched through his gut, lifting him into the air before hurling his body into the campfire. The night devolved into slaughter. the once mighty witch hunters reduced to screaming prey, their holy relics and blessed weapons worthless against the raw power of the beast. Then, a single voice cut through the madness. Enough. Captain Reinhardt stood his ground, his blade gleaming with holy fire, his expression hard, unwavering. Valerius turned, his red eyes locking onto the hunter, his chest still rising and falling from the kill. The two stared at one another, predator and prey. Then, slowly, Valerius took a step back, his form slipping into the mist, his crimson gaze burning with silent mockery. A warning, a challenge. Then he was gone. The survivors of the Order of the Blackened Sun stood among their dead, panting, bloodied, broken. Reinhardt clutched his sword, his knuckles white, his eyes still fixed on the darkness where Valerius had vanished. He had seen monsters before. But this was something new, and he knew this hunt had only just begun. Chapter 13. The Broken Pact. The Whispering Dark. The ruins of Morkine stood like the ribs of a forgotten god, half buried beneath the ashen soil, the remnants of a kingdom long since consumed by madness and undeath. The winds howled through the shattered towers, carrying whispers that had no voices, ghosts of a time when the Strigoi had ruled with clawed fists and iron wills. Among the ruins, in the shadow of a half-collapsed temple, Valerius stood, his massive hunched frame draped in the tattered remnants of his old cloak, his monstrous claws twitching at his sides. He had come for Sylvania. She had guided him, whispered to him, led him along this path of blood and vengeance. She had spoken of power, of breaking the curse, of forging a new legend from the ashes of his old life. But something was wrong. The air was thick with sorcery, an oppressive force settling over his shoulders like chains. And the whispers were not his own. The ritual of chains. Beyond the broken altar, Orana stood in a circle of bone and blackened candles, her robes shifting like living shadows, her bony hands clutching a dagger, carved from the thigh bone of a long-dead king. Her eyes, those horrid empty sockets, burned with a light that was not her own. The Vargolf growled, his instincts snarling at him, warning of treachery. "Your path has led you here, my prince," Orana whispered, her voice slithering through the darkness, a sound both motherly and predatory. "The first relic is yours, but to wield the power you seek, there is one more step you must take." The candles flickered, and in that moment, the air shifted. A weight pressed upon him, as though the shadows themselves were sinking into his flesh, binding around his limbs like invisible chains. Valerius snarled, his claws digging into the stone beneath him. "What is this?" he growled, his voice thick, guttural, somewhere between beast and man. Orana smiled, a terrible, knowing smile. "A gift, my prince," she whispered, "and a cage." She raised the dagger, and the circle of bones around her began to glow, the runes etched into them pulsing with ancient necromantic power. "This is the final step," she continued, "the only way to truly claim the power of the relics." Her voice changed, deepened, becoming something more than her own. "You must surrender, you must be bound." The Vargolf's crimson eyes narrowed, his massive form tensing as realization sank in. This was no gift. This was no blessing. This was a trap. A monster cannot be chained. The magic tightened around him, the pressure immense, as if 1,000 hands were pressing down on his body, forcing him to kneel. Orana stepped forward, her grin widening, her dagger lowering toward his heart. "Do not fight it, my prince," she cooed. "This is what you were meant for. A weapon, a harbinger, a thrall to the Dark Lord." The words slammed into him like iron nails. A thrall, a pawn, a beast to be used and discarded. No, no. Rage surged through him, a fury greater than the hunger, greater than the madness. It was the fire of defiance, of shattered chains, of a will that would never kneel. Arana's dagger descended toward his chest, but the chains did not hold. The Vargulf exploded into motion, shattering the magical bindings with sheer force of will, his massive claws striking out with unnatural speed. Flesh met steel. The dagger clattered to the ground. Arana's smirk faltered, her confidence flickering for the first time. She didn't finish. Valerius' claws drove into her stomach, piercing through skin, through muscle, through the brittle bones beneath, lifting her from the ground in a spray of blackened ichor. Her eyes widened, her mouth opening in silent agony, her fingers twitching as the magic in her veins began to unravel. Valerius lifted her higher, staring into those empty sockets, his voice a growl of pure, unrelenting wrath. "I am no one's pawn." Then he tore her in half. The sound was wet, grotesque, a sickening rip of sinew and splintered bone, a shriek of shattering magic as her body was torn asunder. Her upper half fell to the ground, her arms twitching feebly, her mouth working in silent horror, her life-blood pooling into the runes she had drawn upon the stone. Her lower half collapsed next to her, lifeless. For the first time in centuries, Seer Arana felt fear. You do not know what you have done," she gasped, her voice a wet gurgle, her power failing, her essence leaking into the ground. Valerius knelt, his monstrous form looming over her, his fangs bared in something that was not quite a smile. "Then tell me," he growled. Arana choked, her lips trembling as she whispered her final words. "The Dark One watches. You cannot escape his sight. You cannot deny him forever. You are already his." A moment of silence. Then Valerius crushed her skull beneath his clawed foot, silencing her forever. The broken pact. The ruins fell silent, the shadows curling around the remains of the witch. The binding circle flickered once, then died, the power within it snuffed out like a candle in the wind. Valerius stood among the wreckage, the stench of death and failure thick in the air. For the first time since his transformation, since his fall into darkness, he had not been the hunted. He had been the judge, the executioner, the master of his own fate. He had broken the chains placed upon him. The whispers of Nagash still lingered, curling around the edges of his mind like a distant storm, but he did not bow. He would take the power. He would carve his own legend. But he would do it on his own terms. And if the Dark One sought to claim him, then let him try. With one final lingering snarl, Valerius turned and vanished into the night, the ruins of Morcaine left to rot, the blood of the betrayer still steaming on the broken stone. Chapter 14. The Dark Menagerie. The Road to Madness. The fortress of Lord Vasily the Pale loomed ahead like a cancer upon the land, its spires of black stone curling skyward like the clawed fingers of a dying god. It sat upon a crag of jagged rock, overlooking the blighted wastes of eastern Sylvania, where the very earth was wrong, pulsing with the whispers of old horrors. Here, no moonlight touched the ground. Here the air stank of unnatural life, of alchemy and necromantic corruption, of flesh reshaped and broken, only to be reforged in the crucible of suffering. And it was here that Valerius had come, for within these twisting halls of horror, hidden beneath layers of black magic and blasphemous science, the talon of usherin lay waiting. The lord of flesh and chains. Vasily the Pale was no ordinary vampire. Where others of his kin sought dominion over the living, he sought perfection in the monstrous. He was a scholar of flesh, a butcher masked as an artist, and his experiments had birthed horrors that had no place in the natural order of the world. But above all else, he had a fascination, an obsession with the Vargulf. For centuries he had captured them, studied them, twisted them further into unnatural forms. He saw them not as cursed beings, but as clay to be molded, weapons to be reforged in his image. And in his deepest vaults, where the screams of the damned never ceased, he kept his greatest collection, his menagerie. A prison of monsters, their bodies carved and reshaped, their minds reduced to nothing but hunger and pain. A shadow in the dark. Valerius approached the fortress under the cover of night, moving with unnatural silence, his massive, hunched form blending into the mist. He was not like the others in the menagerie. He was not an experiment. He was the predator that had come for the collector. With a single leap he scaled the ancient walls, his clawed hands finding purchase in the crumbling stone. He moved with deadly precision, slipping past the patrolling wraiths and skeletal guardians, their soulless eyes searching for intruders, but failing to see the nightmare already within their halls. He dropped into a blood-stained corridor, the air thick with the stench of old decay, and moved deeper into the fortress. He did not come to converse. He did not come to negotiate. He came for the talon of usherin. And he came for blood. The cages of the doomed. The deepest chambers of the fortress were a warren of agony. Cells of cold iron and rusted bone lined the walls, filled with things that had once been vampires but were now something else. Some twitched in madness, their flesh torn apart and reforged with sorcerous stitches, their limbs ending in jagged, malformed talons. Others lay in broken heaps, their bodies bloated with necromantic tumors, their mouths stretched too wide, their tongues swollen with unnatural growths. And then there were the vargals. Their eyes gleamed in the dark, their bodies misshapen, warped beyond recognition, some chained by their own entrails, others suspended in vats of black ichor, their minds flayed open for study. These were failed creations, the castaways of Vasili's experiments, the things even he could not control. Valerius snarled, his massive form moving between the cages, his crimson eyes flicking across the horrors displayed before him. A familiar rage boiled in his gut. He had not come to liberate them. They were too far gone. He had come to make sure none would suffer this fate again. And to do that he had to find the monster who had made them. The master of the menagerie. In the center of the great laboratory, surrounded by tomes of forbidden lore, sat Vasily the Pale. His body was thin, almost skeletal, draped in robes of black silk and stitched flesh, his skin pale as parchment, his eyes burning with cruel curiosity. He did not wield a sword. He did not wear armor. But his mind was sharper than any blade, and his magic more potent than steel. He did not look up as Valerius entered. Instead he turned a yellowed page in his tome, speaking as though addressing a stray hound. "You are an anomaly," he murmured, his voice soft yet filled with authority. "You were meant to be like them, a beast, a weapon, an instrument of another's will, and yet you fight it." He looked up then, his cold, calculating eyes meeting Valerius's burning gaze. "A waste," he sighed, "but one I can correct." Then, with a flick of his bony fingers, the menagerie stirred. The arena of monsters. The iron gates burst open, and from the depths of their cages they came. A dozen vargals, each one a nightmare of broken flesh and twisted bone, ravenous and mindless, their mouths foaming with hunger, their claws scraping against the floor as they bounded forward. Vasily watched, serene, as he whispered, "Kill him." The first beast lunged. Valerius met it mid-air, his claws rending through its throat, tearing its head free in a spray of black blood. A second leapt from behind, its jaws snapping for his neck, but he twisted, grabbing its skull and crushing it between his palms like rotten fruit. A third, a fourth, a fifth. He tore through them all. The floor ran slick with gore, the air filled with the howls of dying monsters, their bodies cast aside like butchered cattle. Valerius stood among the corpses, his breath heavy, his massive chest rising and falling, his crimson eyes burning with primal rage. And for the first time Vasily frowned. "Interesting," the vampire muttered. Then he raised his hand, and the talon of usherin, a twisted, gnarled claw of blackened bone and cursed gold, floated toward him. "If you want it," he said, a cruel smile creeping across his lips, "come and take it." Valerius growled, his fangs bared, his claws flexing. There was no hesitation, no thought of retreat. There was only the kill. He charged. The battle had begun. Chapter 15. The Chains of the Past. The Descent into Horror. The stench of death was thick in the air. Not the ordinary decay of corpses, nor the reek of battle, but something older, more insidious, the rotting scent of souls left too long in the dark, of minds frayed and broken, of flesh warped beyond recognition. The corridors beneath Vasily's fortress were carved from ancient stone, but they pulsed like something alive. The very walls seemed to breathe, shifting with a slow, agonized movement, their surfaces slick with necrotic fluids. Whispers slithered through the damp air, voices of things long forgotten, but never truly gone. Valerius moved through the tunnels, his massive bestial frame hunched low, his clawed hands scraping against the blood-stained floor. The battle above had ended, the broken bodies of Vasily's creations left strewn across the laboratory, their limbs twitching in death's final spasms. He had claimed the talon of usherin, now bound to his cursed form, its blackened bone fused into the sinew of his monstrous right hand. It pulsed with stolen power, whispering to him, urging him to take more, to consume, to dominate, to rule. But before he could leave, he had felt it. A pull, deep in the ruins of the fortress's bowels. A presence. Something that called to him. Something that waited. Something that reminded him of himself. And so he had descended, deeper and deeper, past the butchered corpses of failed experiments, past the whimpering things that had once been vampires, past the iron doors sealed with runes of binding, until he reached the final cell, and inside it waited, the thing in the dark. The cell was enormous, an iron cage reinforced with chains as thick as a man's torso, bound with sigils of agony that pulsed with red light. The air was colder here, thick with the weight of something unnatural, something ancient. Something wrong? At first, Valerius thought the creature inside was dead. It did not move, did not breathe. It was hunched over, its massive frame pressed against the far wall, its arms wrapped around its knees, its matted, blackened fur hanging like funeral rags. Then it stirred. The chains groaned as the thing shifted, a slow, shuddering breath escaping its ruined lungs. And then it spoke. "You have come, at last." The voice was something that should not exist. It was deep, echoing, like a whisper from the grave. It was the voice of something that had long since abandoned language, yet remembered its weight. Valerius stared, his red eyes narrowing, his clawed hands tightening. The creature lifted its head, and Valerius saw himself, or rather what he could become, the elder Vargolf. The thing in the cage was ancient. Its flesh had withered, its bones protruding through stretched, leathery skin. Its fangs had grown too long, curling over its cracked lips like the tusks of some nightmarish beast. Its eyes burned red, but they were dim, like embers choking on their last breath. It had been a lord once, just as Valerius had been, but that was long ago. Now it was nothing but a relic, something kept alive only by hunger and the cruelty of time. Valerius stepped closer, his massive frame pressing against the bars, his claws scraping across the rusted iron. "You are like me," he growled, his voice still caught between beast and man. The elder Vargolf let out a rasping chuckle, a sound like cracked bones grinding together. "No," it whispered. "You are like me." A long silence settled between them. "You still fight it," the elder murmured. "You still believe that you are more than this." Valerius' claws flexed, a growl rumbling in his throat. "I am not a slave," he snarled. The elder tilted its head, a slow, pitiful motion. "Neither was I." It shifted forward, the chains rattling, the sigils burning into its flesh. "I fought," once it continued. "I killed, I slaughtered, I took what was mine. I was a king among the dead. And now—" its yellowed fangs gleamed. "Now I wait, I hunger, and one day the hunger will take all that remains." It lifted one long clawed hand, pressing it against its own face, the sharp tips tracing the ruined remains of its once noble features. "And when it does, I will be nothing." The moment of choice. Valerius stood motionless, staring at this grotesque echo of what he could become. His mind burned. Was this what awaited him? Was this his fate? To be another failed beast, a monster locked away in a cage, waiting to be fed upon by his own hunger until nothing remained. No. The talon of usherin pulsed in his hand, the ancient relic whispering of power, of domination, of rising beyond weakness. He was not this thing. He was not a slave to hunger. He was Valerius Von Carstein, and he would never kneel again. His crimson eyes locked onto the elder Vargolf, his massive claws curling into fists. "You have already lost," he snarled. The elder chuckled, but there was no mirth in the sound. "Then kill me," it rasped. "If you are still a king, prove it." The death of the past. The talon of usherin burned against Valerius' flesh, and, with a single movement, he ripped open the cage, the rusted iron shattering beneath his monster. The elder did not resist. It did not beg. It simply looked at him, its dim red eyes filled with something that might have once been relief. Then Valerius struck. His claws tore through the elder's chest, rending bone and flesh, his fangs closing over its throat, ripping away sinew and cartilage. The elder let out a final shuddering breath, and then it was gone. The chains of the past lay broken at Valerius's feet, the corpse of what he could have become crumpled in a pool of blackened blood. Valerius stood over the body, his massive chest rising and falling, his clawed hands still trembling from the kill. Then he turned, and without looking back, he walked into the dark, leaving the past behind him forever. Chapter 16. The War of Night. The Gathering Storm. The noble houses of Sylvania had ruled in darkness for centuries, their power absolute, their dominion unquestioned. They feasted upon the living, played their games of treachery and betrayal, waged silent wars in the shadows, and whispered in their great halls of who among them would sit upon the highest throne. But now they spoke only of one name, a name that should have been forgotten, a name that should have perished in the dungeons of Drakenhof. Valerius Von Carstein. And he was not the same prince they had once exiled. He had become something worse. The Council of Blood. In the black citadel of Drakenhof, deep within the grand chamber of thrones, the lords of undeath convened. The air was thick with sorcery, the great banners of the Von Carstein line hanging like shrouds of death. At the center of the chamber, seated upon a throne of blackened bone, was Lord Merrick von Carstein. His skin was withered yet imperious, his fingers long and talon-like, his eyes sunken and burning with intelligence. He had ruled from the shadows for centuries, never raising his voice, never needing to raise a blade, because it was his will that shaped Sylvania. But now his will was being challenged. Around him stood the assembled nobles of the night, clad in ornate finery, their expressions sharp as the daggers hidden beneath their robes. Among them was Baron Luthar, his once proud face now marred by a cruel scar, a gift from the very monster they had tried to erase. There was Countess Ulrika of the Crimson Veil, her lips still painted with the blood of a lover she had drained dry. And there was Markov the Pale, ancient and silent, his body little more than parchment skin stretched over brittle bone, but his sorcery unmatched. They had all come for one purpose: to end Valerius before he claimed what should not be his. Marek's voice was quiet, yet it carried the weight of centuries of command. "He has grown too strong," he said simply. "We were wrong to leave him alive." Baron Luthar snarled, his fingers twitching toward the crimson scar on his cheek. "I told you this would happen," he spat. "I told you we should have burned his body, scattered his ashes, wiped his name from memory, but no, you wanted to let him rot." "He was supposed to be less than nothing," Ulrika murmured, her eyes gleaming with amusement despite the danger they all faced. "And yet he rises. I admit it is fascinating." Markov the Pale tilted his head, his withered lips parting in something that might have been a smile. "The boy walks a path we do not understand," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "He claims the relics of the first night. He seeks to be more than what we cast him as, and I wonder, what might he become if left unchecked?" Marek's fingers curled around the pommel of his ancient blade, his knuckles tightening. "We do not have the luxury to wonder." He looked at them all, his gaze filled with quiet finality. "We march." And the dead obeyed. The army of the damned. Through the night-black forests of Sylvania, through the ruins of old battlefields, through graveyards where the earth never rested, they gathered their forces. An army of the dead unlike any that had been raised in centuries. Legions of skeletal warriors, their rusted armor bearing the sigils of long-dead noble houses, their bones clattering in silent readiness. Vampiric knights clad in black plate, their steeds nothing but rotting cadavers, their eyes glowing like dying embers. Necromancers, their robes trailing with dark magic, their chants raising the long-buried dead with every whispered syllable. Fell bats and dire wolves, spilling forth from the shadowed caves and tombs, their hunger guided only by the will of their masters. And at the head of it all, riding upon a monstrous undead warhorse, his cloak billowing like a spectre's wings, was Lord Marek himself. He did not need to shout orders. He did not need to call his banners. Because when he moved, the dead moved with him. And they marched for war, the battlefield of oblivion. The army of the vampire lords descended upon the ruins of Morcaine, their footsteps shaking the cursed earth, their torches flickering against the unnatural night. And waiting for them was Valerius. He did not hide. He did not run. He stood upon the broken walls of the ancient city, his massive, monstrous form framed by the eerie glow of necrotic light. His clawed hands resting upon the talon of usherin, its blackened bone pulsing with power. And behind him, the ghouls of Morcaine, crawling from the earth like vermin, their yellow eyes gleaming with hunger, their claws already stained with fresh kills. The forgotten wights, ancient Sylvanian warriors who had sworn themselves to no master but the will of vengeance, their rusted swords gleaming with an unnatural glow. The monstrous dead, flesh constructs, stitched from failed experiments, twisted abominations that should not have existed. And the Vargulfs, the castaway monsters, the things that Vasily had broken and left to rot, now standing at Valerius' side, their hunched frames twitching with barely restrained fury. He had not gathered an army. He had summoned the Forsaken. He had called upon those that the vampire lords had cast away, had rejected, had forgotten, and they had answered, because he was one of them, because he was not a prince of the night anymore. He was something worse. And as the armies of the dead faced each other, as the howl of wolves and the shrieks of the damned filled the night, as Marek raised his blade and Valerius let loose a monstrous roar that shook the very bones of the world itself, the war of night began, and no one would leave it unchanged. Chapter 17. The Siege of Blackspire Keep, a fortress of ash and bone. The ruins of Blackspire Keep loomed against the storm-laden sky, its blackened spires cracked and broken, its once mighty walls crumbling, devoured by centuries of war and decay. It had once been a fortress of men, a bastion against the horrors of Sylvania, but time had claimed it, as it had claimed all things in these forsaken lands. Now it was little more than a tomb, an empty shell where only the dead dared to linger. And tonight it would be a battlefield once more. Inside its ruined halls, Valerius stood, his monstrous form hunched over a table of stone, where the remains of an ancient map lay scattered among old bones and dust. Around him the creatures of his horde gathered. The ghouls of Morcaine, hunched and twitching, their yellowed eyes gleaming with anticipation, their clawed hands twitching in nervous hunger. The forgotten wights, clad in rusted armor, their skeletal forms motionless, their swords gripped in bony fists, awaiting only the command to kill again. The monstrous dead, once failed experiments, now reanimated horrors, their stitched flesh crawling with necrotic energy, their limbs mismatched and grotesque. And the Vargulfs, the outcasts, the forsaken, those who had once served vampire lords, only to be cast aside as failures. They all waited for his word, for he had become their leader. Not by bloodline, not by tradition, by strength, by vengeance. And as he gazed out from the crumbling battlements, he saw them, the army of the damned, marching toward them, their banners of black and crimson fluttering in the howling wind, their legions of skeletal warriors and vampire knights advancing with terrible purpose. And among them, the witch hunters, their torches burning bright, their blessed steel gleaming, their fanatic eyes filled with hatred for all that was unnatural. Two enemies, both seeking to wipe him from existence. Let them come. He would show them what it meant to defy him. The first assault. The night was shattered by the first scream of war. Flaming trebuchets hurled fire and ruin upon the keep, their blazing payloads crashing against the ancient stone, sending shattered masonry raining down into the courtyard. The first wave of undead surged forward, legions of skeletons in rusted armor, their swords flashing in the torchlight, their soulless eyes fixed upon the broken gates of Blackspire Keep. Valerius did not wait. He roared, the sound splitting the night, and his horde answered. The ghouls leapt from the walls, their clawed feet landing among the skeletal ranks, ripping them apart with frenzied hunger. The Vargulfs crashed into the enemy's lines, tearing through armored knights like they were made of paper, their fangs crushing bone, their claws rending flesh. The wights moved like grim executioners, their rusted blades cutting through the witch hunters, their empty sockets burning with an ancient hate. Blood painted the stones red. The dead fought the dead, and in the chaos no quarter was given. The breach. The gate shattered. A siege ram, wreathed in flames, punched through the rotted wood, sending splinters flying into the air, revealing the horde beyond. Vampiric knights rode through the breach, their black steeds trampling anything in their path, their blades glowing with dark enchantments. And behind them the witch hunters charged, their war cries ringing through the night, their silvered weapons gleaming with the promise of absolution through fire and steel. The battle became slaughter. A Vargulf howled as a blessed stake was driven into its heart, its massive body convulsing before crumbling into dust. A ghoul shrieked as it was cut down by a witch-hunter's silvered blade, its lifeless corpse trampled beneath armored boots. A vampire knight clashed with a wight, their swords locking in a furious dance of death, neither willing to yield, neither able to truly die. Valerius did not hesitate. He waded into the slaughter, his clawed hands raking through armor and flesh alike, his fangs sinking into throats, his roar shaking the battlefield. A knight turned to strike him, but Valerius moved faster, tearing off the warrior's arm at the shoulder before ripping out his spine with a single, brutal movement. A witch-hunter raised a blessed pistol, its barrel glowing with holy fire. Valerius caught the man's wrist, twisting it until bones snapped before crushing his skull against the stones. The battle raged on, and still they kept coming. The duel of lords. Then the ground trembled. The dead stopped, as if sensing something greater had entered the field. And from the darkness, upon a monstrous skeletal steed, Lord Valerius Von Carstein rode forth. His black armor glistened in the firelight, his cloak billowing like the wings of a carrion bird, his eyes burning with the cold fury of an ancient king. And he spoke only one word, Valerius. The battlefield fell silent as the two lords of the night locked eyes. One, the ancient ruler, the master of Sylvania's order, the keeper of its traditions. The other, the fallen prince, the beast made flesh, the living vengeance of all who had been cast aside. This was inevitable. They had always been destined to stand on opposite sides of this war. And so, without another word, Valerius churched. Maric's blade rose. The war of night had found its true climax. Chapter 18. Blood and Fire. A duel, decades in the making. The battle raged around them, but Valerius saw only one enemy, Baron Luthar, the man who had orchestrated his fall, the one who had bound him in silver, who had laughed as the curse consumed him, who had sought to make him an example of what happens to those who reach beyond their station. But Luthar had failed, and now he would pay the price. The ruins of Blackspire Keep burned, the cries of dying men and monsters filling the air, but as Valerius and Luthar locked eyes across the broken courtyard, the war seemed to fade into the background. This was not the clash of armies. This was vengeance, personal and absolute. Luthar's crimson cloak billowed behind him, his black plate armor gleaming with enchantments, his blade drawn, its edge wreathed in dark sorcery. His face was twisted into a smirk, but his eyes betrayed something else. Uncertainty. Fear. Because the Valerius before him was no longer the prince he had betrayed. And he was certainly no mindless beast. He was something worse. Something that had survived. And Luthar had not planned for that. The first exchange. Luthar moved first, his sword flashing in the firelight, aiming to cleave Valerius in half with a single swing. Valerius dodged. He was faster now, faster than any vampire had a right to be. His Vagol form did not hinder him, it strengthened him. His clawed foot shattered the ground as he lunged, closing the distance between them in the blink of an eye. Luthar barely had time to raise his sword before Valerius's massive claws smashed against his guard, sending the Baron skidding backward across the courtyard, his boots carving trenches in the stone. The smirk vanished from Luthar's face. "You," he hissed, regaining his stance, his eyes burning with fury. "You are nothing. You were supposed to be nothing." Valerius tilted his head, his fanged grin glinting in the flickering firelight. He spoke, and his voice was deep, guttural, a growl of something that was no longer fully human, yet far too intelligent to be dismissed as mere beast. "Try to kill me again, Luthar." His lips curled back, revealing jagged fangs still wet with the blood of the fallen. "See what happens. The true battle begins." Luthar roared and charged. His blade moved in a flurry of slashes, dark magic lacing every strike, the cursed steel screaming as it tore through the air. Valerius met him head-on, his massive claws crashing against the blade, sparks raining from the impact. The force of their blows shattered the ground beneath them, sending cracks spiderwebbing through the courtyard stones. Luthar struck for Valerius hard. Valerius twisted, dodging by a hair's breadth, then raked his claws across Luthar's breastplate, tearing through steel and flesh alike. Luthar staggered, crimson blood leaking from deep gashes across his ribs, but still he fought on. He swung low, trying to sever Valerius' legs. Valerius leapt, flipping over the strike, landing behind him in an instant. Before Luthar could react, Valerius seized him by the back of the neck and drove his skull into the stone with bone-crushing force. The impact sent cracks ripping through the courtyard. Luthar gasped in pain, struggling to push himself up. Valerius did not let him. He slammed his foot onto Luthar's back, pinning him, his massive claws pressing against the Baron's skull. "Is this what you expected?" Valerius snarled. Luthar choked, blood running from his lips. He clawed at the ground, trying to push himself free, trying to summon the magic to break Valerius' hold. But it was too late. Valerius lifted him, hurling him across the courtyard like a broken doll. Luthar crashed into the remains of a toppled column, the stone shattering beneath the impact, his body slumping forward, barely able to move. For the first time in centuries, Baron Luthar von Carstein was truly afraid. The death of a tyrant. Valerius stalked toward him, his crimson eyes burning, his muscles coiling like a predator ready to strike. Luthar tried to rise, but his legs faltered, his body broken and battered. He spat blood, glaring up at the beast before him. "I should have." Valerius moved. In a single, blindingly fast motion, his clawed hand shot forward, piercing through Luthar's chest, gripping his still-beating heart. Luthar gasped, his eyes widening in shock, his body convulsing as Valerius lifted him into the air. Their eyes met one final time. "You never should have let me live," Valerius growled. And then he crushed Luthar's heart in his fist. Luthar let out a final ragged scream as his body convulsed, his veins blackening, his flesh withering, his once proud face twisted in agony, his body collapsing into dust as the last of his stolen immortality was ripped away. Valerius let the ashen remains drift between his fingers, his crimson gaze never leaving the spot where his old rival had stood. The last betrayal had been avenged, but his hunger was not sated. The blood of an old vampire was potent, filled with centuries of stolen power, and as Valerius dropped to one knee, his claws sinking into the pool of blood that remained, he could feel it calling to him. He drank deep. The power rushed through his veins like wildfire, his muscles tensing, his wounds sealing, his very essence twisting into something darker, something stronger. And as he rose once more, his eyes burning brighter, his claws sharper, his monstrous form even more terrifying than before, he realized one truth. He was no longer simply a survivor. He was a predator. And now the true lords of Sylvania would learn to fear him. They had tried to erase his name. Now they would curse it forever. Chapter 19. The Feast of Madness. The Aftermath of Slaughter. The ruins of Blackspire Keep were soaked in blood and ruin. The battle was over, but the echoes of violence still lingered, the scent of spilled entrails and burning flesh clinging to the air like an unholy incense. The dead littered the courtyard, bodies torn apart in a frenzy of fangs and claws. Some still twitched, their final moments stretched by unnatural undeath, their ripped-open throats still gurgling faint, pitiful noises. And at the center of it all, Valerius stood. His monstrous frame heaved, his crimson eyes smoldering, his clawed hands still slick with blood. The power of Luthar's essence coursed through him like fire in his veins, burning, changing, twisting. He had won. He had taken vengeance. He had torn his rival's heart from his chest and drank deep of his stolen power. And yet, the hunger remained, the stirring of the beast. He had felt it before, the creeping sensation of his mind slipping, of instinct clawing against reason, of his own monstrous nature whispering sweetly in his ear. But now, it was louder. It was closer. His body was changing, his muscles swelling, his senses sharpening, but so too was his mind unraveling. He could smell their blood, the survivors of the battle, both his own forces and those who still clung to the last shreds of life. A dying knight, slumped against the wreckage of a fallen tower, his breastplate split open, his lungs exposed through a gaping wound. A ghoul, wounded but still twitching in the dirt, its broken body pathetically dragging itself toward safety. A wounded necromancer, trying to crawl away, one arm missing, his whispers of magic faltering between gurgles of blood. And Valerius could taste them all. The hunger screamed within him. It demanded more. It was not satisfied. The blood of Baron Luthar had been rich, powerful, but it had only awakened something deeper inside him. He was not full. He would never be full. And that was when he felt it. The creeping, slow decay of his own willpower, the subtle slip of his mind into something more primal, something bestial, something mindless. He had spent so long fighting against it, convincing himself that he was still more than just hunger and rage. But now the beast was winning. A feast without end. Valerius staggered forward, his claws flexing involuntarily, his monstrous breath coming in ragged gasps. His sight flickered between clarity and madness, the edges of his vision warping, pulsing with the beat of the blood in his veins. He saw the knight and lunged. His massive claws crashed through the man's chest, ripping apart his ribcage, his lungs spilling out like overripe fruit. The knight screamed, a sound that should have been human. But Valerius did not care. He tore out the man's heart, devouring it in one savage bite, the hot rush of lifeblood sliding down his throat, igniting his hunger like an inferno. He barely even heard the others cry out in horror. He barely even noticed his own ghouls shrinking away from him, their yellowed eyes wide with animal fear. Because they could see it. They could see what he was becoming. And still, it was not enough. He needed more. He turned toward the crawling ghoul, the pathetic creature who had once fought for him, who had once seen him as a leader. It whimpered, its clawed fingers digging into the mud, trying to flee. But Valerius moved faster. His jaws clamped onto the thing's skull, and with a sickening crack he crushed it between his fangs, its flesh and bones splitting apart, its brain matter running hot over his tongue. More. He grabbed the necromancer next, wrenching the man's one remaining arm from his body, the sorcerer's scream echoing into the night as his blood pooled onto the broken stones. His crimson eyes burned, his breath heavy, his mind slipping deeper into the abyss. There was no Valerius anymore. Only the hunger, the thin thread of sanity. Amen? A voice. Not from the dying, not from the screaming, not from the monsters that served him. It was a voice within himself, and it whispered one thing. Is this what you wanted? Is this what you have become? Another beast, another monster to be caged and forgotten. The voice was his own. It was Valerius, the one who had sworn he would not be their pawn, the one who had refused to kneel, the one who had vowed that he would be something greater. The hunger was winning, but he had not lost. Not yet. Not now. With a snarl of fury, he forced himself back. His massive claws trembled, his fangs still dripping with the remnants of flesh and bone, his veins still burning with the intoxication of fresh kills. But he did not take another step forward. He fought it. He dragged himself back from the abyss. The survivors of his horde watched in silence, their fear still lingering, their eyes still filled with uncertainty. and Valerius stood among them, his breath slow, controlled, heavy. He would not be lost to hunger. Not yet. Not now. He had claimed power, but he would not become a mindless beast. He had enemies left to destroy. He had a throne to take. He had a war to win. The hunger would not take him today. But the battle was not over. And deep inside, he knew, one day it would come for him again. Chapter 20. The Ghoul King's Throne. The Descent into Madness. The catacombs of Morcaine yawned before him, a gaping maw of black stone and endless dark. The air that slithered from its depths was thick with rot, filled with the scent of decayed flesh and centuries-old filth. This was no mere tomb. It was a wound in the land, a place where the dead did not rest, where the forgotten kin of Usherin still clung to their madness and hunger. And deep within, on a throne of filth and bone, sat the Ghoul King. He was Valerius' next obstacle. The crown of the forgotten prince was here, one of the 5 relics of the first night, hidden beneath the feet of those who had long since lost their minds. Valerius had come to claim it, and he would do so in blood. The court of cannibals. The tunnels writhed with life. As Valerius descended, the walls narrowed, the shadows tightened, and the air grew heavier with the stench of carrion. And then he saw them. The ghouls of Morcaine, twisted, hunched things covered in filth and gore, their yellowed eyes glinting in the darkness, their jaws lined with shattered, jagged teeth. They were not mere scavengers. They were something far worse. Some had grown massive, their spines curling out of their backs like ridges of jagged bone, their clawed fingers dragging through the dirt like great scythes. Others had warped into grotesque shapes, their limbs twisted at unnatural angles, their mouths stretched too wide, gaping with a hunger that had long since become insatiable. And then there were the ancient ones, the warlords of a forgotten kingdom, once noble, now little more than whispering beasts, their eyes burning with a dim, feral intelligence. They were all waiting, because they had sensed him. They could smell his blood, not just as prey, but as something different, something that should not exist. And at the end of the cavern, seated upon a throne of gnawed bone, was their king, the Ghoul King of Morcaine. The Ghoul King was not like the others. He was massive, his hulking body swathed in ancient, tattered robes, his muscles coiled with unnatural strength. His fangs were too long, jutting from his lower jaw like the tusks of a beast, his clawed hands resting on the arms of his throne. But his eyes, they were not empty. They burned with a dim, ancient cruelty, not mindless hunger, but something worse. A madness that had worn away everything except the will to rule. When he spoke, his voice was a rasping growl, filled with centuries of rot and contempt. Another pretender comes to my court. His massive hands flexed, his nails clicking against the bone of his throne. You reek of stolen power. You walk in the shadow of usherin, but you are not of his blood. Valerius stepped forward, his crimson eyes meeting the king's glare without fear. I am more than his blood, he snarled. I am more than you. The horde stirred, the lesser ghouls hissing, chittering, their claws scraping against the stone. The Ghoul King bared his fangs, his lips pulling back in a grin that was nothing but hunger and mockery. If you want my throne, he rasped, rising from his seat, his enormous bulk casting a shadow over the cavern, then take it. The court erupted into chaos. The feast of beasts. The first ghoul leapt at Valerius, shrieking. Valerius caught it mid-air, his claws sinking into its throat, tearing its head from its shoulders in one brutal motion. Blood sprayed across the stones, hot and foul, but he did not stop. A second lunged low, claws aiming for his legs. Valerius twisted, raking his talons across its belly, splitting it open, sending its entrails spilling onto the cavern floor. The others hesitated, because they could see it now. He was not just another challenger. He was not here to fight for survival. He was here to claim them, to rule them. A Vargulf did not belong in the court of ghouls, but a king did, and so he charged. He waded into the horde, his massive frame smashing through their ranks, his claws cutting through flesh, his fangs sinking into bone. A ghoul warlord tried to resist, raising a rusted cleaver, but Valerius caught the blade in his bare hand, twisting it free before driving his clawed fist through the warlord's skull. Another attacked from behind, but he grabbed it by the spine and ripped it in half, its dying shriek cut off in a wet gurgle. The cavern became a slaughterhouse. The horde that had ruled these tunnels for centuries was falling apart, piece by piece, their bodies torn, their screams echoing into the deep. And then the Ghoul King moved. The duel of predators. The impact shook the cavern. The Ghoul King crashed into Valerius, their massive forms colliding like two great beasts, sending shattered stone raining from the ceiling. The king struck first, his massive clawed hand smashing into Valerius' ribs, sending him slamming into a pillar of broken skulls. Pain tore through his body. The hunger roared inside him. Valerius snarled, leaping forward, his claws slashing at the king's chest, tearing deep gouges into flesh and muscle. But the king did not stop. He bit down on Valerius' shoulder, his fangs sinking deep, crunching through sinew and bone. Valerius roared in agony, but he did not falter. He lashed out, his massive claws sinking into the Ghoul King's sides, tearing at his ribs, his stomach, his spine. The two titans locked in a bloody embrace, their claws and fangs rending flesh, their roars shaking the tunnels. And then Valerius struck the final blow. His fangs sank into the king's throat, and he tore it free. The Ghoul King staggered, gargling, choking, his eyes wide with disbelief. His massive body crumpled, collapsing onto the stones, his lifeblood pooling beneath him. And as the remaining ghouls cowered, trembling, awaiting their own deaths, Valerius stepped forward. He climbed the throne of bone, his clawed hand reaching out to grasp the crown of the forgotten prince. And as he placed it upon his head, the horde of ghouls bowed before him. He was their king now. He had won, and he was one step closer to becoming something greater than a monster. Chapter 21. The Crown of Usherin. The Tomb of the Forgotten King. The air was thick with the scent of old death, heavy with the weight of sorcery long since buried but never dormant. Beneath the ruins of Morkine, hidden within the deepest crypts of the ancient Strigoi Empire, lay the final artifact, the crown of usherin, the last relic of the first night, the final piece that would allow Valerius to forge his own destiny. It was not merely an object. It was a symbol of dominion, a sigil of power claimed through savagery, of rule not through nobility, but through fear and blood. To wear it was to command the forgotten legions of the Strigoi. To wield its power was to transcend the curse, to become something greater. But to take it meant facing the guardian that had never ceased its vigil, the skeletal colossus of Usherin, a monstrosity of bone and magic, a thing bound to the will of the first flesh-eater king, a guardian that had been left to rot yet still remained, waiting. And now Valerius had come for its charge. The crypt stretched before him, its walls lined with the bones of those long forgotten, their empty sockets staring from the gloom, their silent screams still lingering in the air. And at the end of the hall, upon a great stone pedestal, resting in the pale glow of necrotic energy, was the crown of Usherin. It was made of blackened bone, its spires jagged, its edges stained with dried blood, and it hummed with a presence that had never truly faded. It called to him, but before he could take it, The darkness shifted. The tomb stirred, and the guardian awoke. The guardian of the first king. A deep, grinding sound filled the air, like stone tearing itself apart, a groan of something massive being roused from slumber. The bones along the walls trembled, a ripple of ancient power moving through them before they broke free, sliding toward the center of the crypt, merging, fusing, twisting into something monstrous. The skeletal colossus rose. It was towering, grotesque, a thing not made of a single corpse, but of countless dead, their bones woven together by necrotic energy, their skulls layered upon each other like armor, their limbs stretched into unnatural proportion. Its head was crowned with the remains of a Strigoi lord, its eye sockets burning with the last remnants of Usherin's will, its mouth twisted in a permanent rictus of silent wrath. It carried no weapon, for it was the weapon. It existed only to destroy, and it turned its hollow gaze upon Valerius. The ancient runes upon its bones flared to life, pulsing with a sickly green glow, filling the chamber with a low, humming resonance that made the very air tremble. Then it attacked. The Colossus strikes. Valerius leapt aside as a massive clawed hand crashed down where he had stood, shattering the stones, sending cracks through the crypt. He moved like a shadow, faster than even the undead could track, his Vargulf body twisting through the air, landing in a crouch. But the Colossus did not slow. It lurched forward, its massive hands sweeping across the chamber, catching Valerius mid-mace and hurling him across the tomb. Stone shattered, bones snapped. Valerius hit the far wall, the impact crushing ancient remains beneath his weight, sending dust and fragments of skulls flying. But he was not broken. He had endured worse. He rose from the rubble, his crimson eyes gleaming, his claws flexing, his body already healing. The Colossus lumbered forward, each step shaking the tomb, its bony fists cracking the floor as it prepared to strike again. But Valerius was already moving. The duel of bone and beast. He charged, his massive claws flashing through the air, aiming for the guardian's spine. The Colossus turned unnaturally fast, its massive arms swinging toward him. Valerius ducked beneath the strike, twisting, driving his claws into its ribs, ripping through the enchanted bone. The guardian groaned, the necrotic runes upon its body flaring brighter, its wound sealing almost instantly. It would not die so easily. The Colossus struck again, its fist slamming into Valerius' shoulder, sending him skidding back across the stone. Pain flared in his bones. But pain was nothing compared to hunger. He leapt again, this time aiming for the skull, his fangs bared, his claws outstretched. And then he saw it. At the heart of the Colossus, buried within its ribcage, was a glowing core, the source of its undeath, the heart of its magic. The Colossus swung at him again, but this time Valerius did not dodge. He took the hit. He let it drive him into the ground. And then he struck. His clawed hand shot forward, piercing through the Colossus' chest, tearing through ribs, reaching deep, wrapping around the core of its magic. The bones screamed. The guardian thrashed. But Valerius did not let go. He ripped the core free, its glowing energy burning against his palm, its power resisting, trying to consume him. And then he devoured it. He tore it apart with fang and claw, absorbing its essence, drinking the last remnants of Usherin's will. The Colossus spasmed, its bones cracking, splitting, crumbling, and then, with a final shuddering groan, it collapsed into dust. The crown claimed. The crypt fell silent, the only sound Valerius' heavy breath, the only movement the slow trickle of dust settling in the air. And there, waiting for him, upon its pedestal of black stone, was the crown of usherin, his final prize. He reached out, his clawed hand wrapping around it, lifting it from its resting place. The moment he touched it, a surge of power rushed through him, whispering of ancient kings, of forgotten empires, of a throne that had never truly been abandoned. He had done it. The relics were his. The path to his ascension was complete. And now, Sylvania would burn. Chapter 22. The Doom That Came to Drakenhof. The Gathering of the Dead. The halls of Drakenhof Castle were thick with candlelight and tension, the flickering flames casting grotesque shadows upon the ancient stone walls, where the histories of the Von Carsteins had been carved in relief, a lineage of tyranny and bloodshed, betrayal and triumph. And tonight they gathered once more, not for celebration, not for political maneuvering, not even for war as they had known it before. Tonight they gathered in fear. Word had come. The monster they had cast out, the prince they had forgotten, the failure they had mocked, the beast they had doomed to madness, had not perished. Valerius Von Carstein lived, and he had returned. The council of blood and shadows. The great lords of Sylvania filled the chamber, their faces etched with pale fury, their elegant finery stained with the stench of old death. They sat upon their dark thrones, draped in ancient robes, their predatory eyes burning like embers beneath heavy brows. At the head of them all sat Lord Valerius Von Carstein, the oldest of them, his gaunt frame wrapped in a cloak of black silk, his fingers gripping the arms of his throne, as though he could crush the very wood beneath them. To his right, Countess Ulrika of the Crimson Veil, her lips still red from the blood of a fresh kill, her clawed fingers drumming impatiently upon the marble table. To his left, Markov the Pale, the necromancer lord, his body little more than bone and dry sinew, his hollow gaze fixed upon the brazier that flickered in the center of the chamber. And there, standing before them, battered and trembling, was the messenger. A vampiric knight, once proud, now little more than a broken shell, his armor scorched, his face slashed open, his eyes wide with something that should have been impossible for a creature of the night. Terror. He knelt, his voice shaking as he spoke. He has returned. Marek's voice was cold as the grave. Tell us. The knight swallowed, his body trembling as he forced himself to continue. Blackspire Keep has fallen. Murmurs rippled through the gathered lords, soft at first, then rising like a tide of unease. We sent an army to crush him, the knight continued, to wipe him from existence before he could gather strength. He hesitated, his fingers digging into the blood-stained floor. They are all dead. The room fell silent. Not defeated, not scattered, not turned. Marek's clawed hands tightened on the armrests of his throne. No. The knight shuddered, his eyes flicking up toward them. As the relics. A single sentence, and the silence in the room became a crushing weight. The talon of Usherin. The crown of the forgotten prince. The heart of the first knight. The veil of night, and now the crown of Usherin itself. He had them all. Valerius was no longer a beast. He was something new, something worse. The unthinkable truth. Markov the Pale's voice broke the silence, a whisper like the shifting of old parchment. If he wears the crown. His skeletal fingers tightened around his staff, his expression unreadable. Is no longer merely a rogue vampire, no longer a beast. He turned his gaze upon Marek, his eyeless sockets glowing with necrotic light. He's a king. The air turned colder. The very mention of it was an abomination. The Strigoi had no kings. They had been cast out, condemned to be monsters and scavengers, unfit to rule, unfit to be called brethren to the true nobility of the night. And yet, here was one of them, standing on the threshold of dominion, wearing the crown of the ancient past, invoking the name of the first and only Strigoi king. Valerius had claimed the throne of Usherin. And if he was not stopped, then all of Sylvania would kneel before him. Ulrika's voice was a snarl, her sharp nails digging into the marble table, as she rose from her seat. "We cannot allow this," she hissed. "We have spent centuries ensuring the Strigoi remain feral, broken, forgotten. If Valerius is allowed to march upon Drakenhof, others will rally to his side, those who have long despised us, those who have suffered under our rule." She turned, her eyes burning with cold fury. "Even the lesser vampires will flock to him. The outcasts, the warbands, the traitors. And then we will burn." They had exiled him to the wilds, believing he would rot. Instead, they had given birth to their greatest enemy. Marek closed his eyes, exhaling slowly, and when he opened them, they burned with the will of the Von Carsteins. "Then we strike first." His voice was iron, his decision final. "All of our forces, every knight, every thrall, every necromancer in our service." He turned to Ulrika. "Summon the Von Carstein war bands from the east." Then to Markov, "Raise the ancient dead, call upon the wraiths, the banshees, summon the great warlords who have not walked in centuries. If Valerius wanted war, then war he would have. This is no longer an exile." Marek's voice boomed through the chamber, final and absolute. "This is an execution, the doom that comes for Valerius." The night sky over Drakenhof was black and starless, the winds carrying the scent of battle yet to come. Legions of undead knights began to march. Necromancers raised the long-buried dead, whispering the names of ancient warlords into the darkness, summoning them to war once more. The skies filled with shrieking fell bats, their crimson eyes glimmering as they took flight. Dire wolves howled into the wind, their eerie cries echoing across the dead plains of Sylvania. The greatest army the vampire lords had gathered in centuries began its march. And they marched for one purpose alone: to obliterate the one who dared to challenge their dominion. Meanwhile, far from Drakenhof, standing atop the ruins of a forgotten empire, Valerius felt the shift in the winds, the pulse of magic in the air, the coming storm of war. They were coming for him. He bared his fangs, his crimson eyes burning with hunger, with fury, with something beyond both. Let them come. He was ready, and he would show them what it meant to defy a king. Chapter 23. The Witch Hunter's Final Stand. A battlefield of the damned. The fields of Ebon Moor had once been a place of battle, a land drenched in blood long before this night, where generations of warriors had clashed and fallen, their bones now lost beneath the cursed soil. It was fitting that it would be here where the last stand of the witch hunters would take place. A storm churned above, the sky boiling with black clouds, lightning flashing in jagged veins. The land groaned beneath unnatural weight, the air thick with necromantic corruption. And in the distance, he came. Valerius stood atop the ridge, his monstrous form framed by fire and shadow, his crown gleaming in the darkness, his clawed hands curling with anticipation. Behind him the dead marched, ghouls, wights, wraiths, and the forsaken things that had crawled from the ruins of Morcaine to answer his call. Vargulfs snarled in the gloom, their massive frames coiled and ready to pounce. Legions of skeletal warriors stood in eerie silence, their rusted blades held high. The ghosts of the long-slain hovered in the mist, whispering curses that had no language, only hatred. They were not just an army. They were a force of ruin, a tide of death given purpose, moving under one will, one voice, one command. And against them, across the shattered plain, the witch hunters waited. The Templars of Sigmar, prepare. Captain Reinhard did not kneel. Even with doom upon him, even with his men outnumbered, surrounded, he stood tall, his weathered armor stained with old battles, his silvered greatsword held firm in his gauntleted grip. He had hunted monsters for decades. He had burned vampires in their coffins. He had purged witches, broken cults, driven back the darkness where others had failed. But never had he faced something like this. Witch hunters in black and gold surcoats stood beside him, their hands gripping blessed silver blades, their faces grim but resolute. Sigmarite priests chanted prayers of fire, their hammers aglow with divine energy. Marksmen readied silver-shot rifles, their muzzles trained on the advancing tide. Warrior monks kneeled in the dirt, carving holy runes into their own flesh, preparing to die in righteous fury. There was no retreat, only war. Reinhardt turned to his men, his voice like iron against the storm. We do not fight for glory. We do not fight for honor. We fight because no one else will. He raised his greatsword high, the runes flaring with golden light, the sigil of Sigmar burning bright upon the steel. We are the last wall between this abomination and the Empire. And tonight we bring him to ruin. His warriors roared in defiance. And then the dead charged. The onslaught of the damned. The battlefield erupted into chaos. The first wave hit like a storm, a howling tide of ghouls, their yellow eyes gleaming, their claws tearing for flesh. The witch hunters did not waver. Gunfire rang out. Silver-shot bullets tore through undead flesh, ghouls shrieking as their bodies convulsed, bones shattered, skulls exploding in crimson mist. Priests swung war hammers, their weapons glowing with divine wrath, crushing undead skulls, sending wraiths screaming into the abyss. Witch hunters fought like cornered beasts, their silvered swords slicing through rotting bodies, their fury unrelenting. But it was not enough. The second wave crashed down, wights in rusted armor, their blades dripping with curses older than the Empire itself. A witch hunter screamed as his body withered before he could even raise his sword, his skin turning to ash, his bones crumbling to dust. A Templar swung his greatsword, only for a Vargulf to land upon him, its massive jaws crushing him in a spray of blood. The line was breaking. And then Valerius descended. A duel in the storm. Reinhardt turned, and there he was. A monstrous shadow, a nightmare given flesh, a thing of fury and bloodlust, his crimson eyes glowing beneath the crown of usherin. The fallen prince, the usurper king, the hunger that would never end. Their eyes met, and then they charged. Valerius struck first, his clawed hand crashing down, but Reinhardt met it with steel, their impact sending a shockwave of force through the battlefield. Their blades clashed, Reinhardt's greatsword glowing with holy fire, Valerius' talon of usherin screeching with dark magic. The air rippled with their fury. Each strike shook the ground. Each blow was meant to kill. Reinhardt drove his knee into Valerius' ribs, his silver-plated gauntlet smashing into the beast's jaw. Valerius roared and retaliated, his massive clawed hand catching Reinhardt's arm, twisting it, shattering the bone with an audible crack. The captain gasped, but did not fall. He fought on. With his one good hand he raised his sword high, the light of Sigmar flaring brighter, the runes igniting in golden flame. And he brought it down upon Valerius' chest. The steel bit deep. The light seared undead flesh. Valerius howled in pain, but he did not fall. He grasped Reinhardt by the throat, lifted him high, and in a single brutal motion he tore out the captain's heart. The fall of the witch hunters. Reinhardt gasped, his body convulsing, his lifeblood spilling over Valerius' claws. His sword fell from his grip, clattering onto the blood-drenched stones. His eyes locked onto his enemy one final time. And then Valerius devoured his heart. He drank of his last breath. And Captain Reinhardt, the bane of vampires, the last hope of the Empire, was no more. The witch hunters saw their leader fall, and despair broke them. The dead surged forward, consuming what remained. their shrieks drowning out the last defiant cries of men who had sworn to end the night. By dawn, there would be no survivors. By dawn, the last witch hunters of Sylvania would be gone. And as Valerius stood atop the corpses of the fallen, the crown of usherin gleaming upon his monstrous brow, he turned his gaze toward Drakenhof. They thought they could stop him. They thought they could kill him. Now they would learn what it meant to fear a king. Chapter 24. A Bargain with the Dead. The Land of Bones. The battlefield was silent. Not the silence of peace, nor the hushed breath before war, but a silence that belonged to the forgotten, to the unclaimed dead, to the thousands of nameless souls buried beneath the earth, their memories lost to time. This was the Valley of Carrion, a place where the dead had been abandoned, where the bones of long-dead warriors lay undisturbed beneath the blackened soil, where no mortal dared to tread for fear of the curses whispered upon the wind. But tonight the dead would rise again, and they would march beneath a new king. Valerius stood at the heart of the valley, his massive Vargulf frame hunched, his crimson eyes burning in the darkness, the crown of usherin resting upon his monstrous brow. The artifacts glowed with cold power, their combined energies twisting the air, warping the veil between life and undeath, bending the forgotten whispers of the past to his will. Tonight, he would no longer be merely a revenant prince, a monster of vengeance. Tonight, he would become a lord of the dead. The summoning begins. Valerius lifted the talon of usherin, the ancient relic dripping with necrotic energy, its power humming in his grip like a living thing. He spoke no incantations. There was no need for words. The artifacts did not require prayers. They did not ask, they demanded. The earth trembled beneath his feet. A low groan echoed through the valley, the sound of graves stirring, of things long dead sensing the call of their new master. The ground cracked, fissures splitting the land, and then the first hand burst from the soil. Then another, and another. They were waking. The forgotten warlords, the nameless soldiers, the massacred legions who had perished on this cursed land centuries ago, their souls bound to the soil, their corpses trapped in the endless slumber of unfulfilled vengeance. Tonight they would march again. The rise of the dead. A skeleton pulled itself free, its armor rusted and broken, its jaw unhinged in a silent scream. A rotting knight emerged next, his flesh half decayed, his skeletal fingers still gripping the remnants of a shattered sword. Then came the whites, their eyeless sockets burning with cold fire, their battle-scarred bodies clad in spectral remnants of ancient armor. And then came the true horrors. Colossal undead behemoths, remnants of ancient monstrous warriors, their bones reforged by necrotic magic, their towering forms casting massive shadows against the moonlit sky. Flesh golems, stitched together from the corpses of 100 warriors, their limbs fused with weapons, their soulless gazes fixed upon their new master. Phantom warlords, wreathed in ethereal darkness, their weapons glowing with the hatred of centuries, their voices whispering forgotten war cries. Valerius had done more than summon an army. He had awakened the ghosts of war itself. And as they gathered before him, their empty eyes locked onto the creature who had called them forth, their souls still bound to the battlefield that had claimed them centuries ago, there was a moment of hesitation. Would they kneel? Would they serve? Would they fight for him or against him? And so Valerius made his bargain. A king's ultimatum. Valerius stepped forward, his monstrous form towering over the gathering horde, his clawed hand gripping the crown of usherin, the power of the first Strigoi king coursing through him. "I know your names." His voice was low, guttural, filled with a power that did not belong to the living or the dead. You were cast aside, you were betrayed, You were left to rot beneath the earth, your stories lost, your victories erased, your legacies consumed by time. The dead listened. I do not come to beg your service. The necrotic energy swirled around him, thick like fog, crackling with raw, unrestrained power. I do not come to command you as cattle. The undead warlords stiffened, the phantoms whispering among themselves, their shadows flickering in the cursed wind. I come to offer you what was stolen. The sky darkened further, the air thick with ancient magic. A chance to take revenge upon those who let you perish. A ripple of recognition moved through the horde. A chance to march again, to destroy those who call themselves rulers, to bring ruin to those who sit in castles built upon your corpses. The skeletal knights clenched their rusted blades. The white's flames burned brighter. The phantom warlords turned their glowing gazes to their newfound king. I do not seek servants. He lifted the crown of usherin high, its power pulsing in time with the slow beat of the undead hearts before him. I seek vengeance. The dead roared. Their weapons lifted, their voices howled in agreement. And Valerius knew he had won. The march of the dead. The valley of Carrion trembled as the legions of the forgotten dead took their first steps forward. The once silent fields now echoed with the sound of rusted armor, with the groans of revenants who had been denied rest for far too long. Valerius led them forward, his crimson eyes fixed upon the distant horizon. Ahead lay Drakenhof. Ahead lay the final battle, and the vampire lords who had cast him out, who had sought to destroy him, who had feared what he could become, would soon learn the folly of their arrogance. They had tried to break him. Now he would break them. The doom of Sylvania had arrived, and Valerius marched at its head. Chapter 25. The Twilight of Sylvania. The night the dead marched. The sky above Sylvania was thick with storm clouds, their swollen forms rolling like a sea of black tar, blotting out even the pale light of the moon. Lightning split the heavens, illuminating the land below, a land of ghosts, of dead trees swaying in a wind that carried the stench of decay, of graveyards that never rested. And beneath that cursed sky, war came. The legions of the forsaken dead moved across the land like a wave of ruin, an unstoppable force surging toward Drakenhof, the great bastion of the Von Carsteins, the seat of Sylvania's ruling aristocracy. At their head, towering over the march of ghouls and wights, Valerius Von Carstein led the charge. His crimson eyes burned beneath the crown of usherin, his monstrous form draped in the shadows of war, the talon of usherin pulsing with necrotic power. He was no longer an exile, no longer a beast to be hunted. He was a king, and tonight he had come to take what was his. The lords of Drakenhof prepare. Within the walls of Drakenhof, the vampire lords gathered. The great citadel stood atop a cliff of black stone, its walls slick with rain, its gargoyle-covered towers looming over the landscape like the watchful eyes of long-dead tyrants. And now those tyrants prepared for war. Lord Valerius Von Carstein, eldest of the aristocracy, stood upon the highest balcony, his long black cloak whipping in the wind, his fingers clenched around the pommel of an ancient blade, infused with the blood of 10,000 souls. Countess Ulrika of the Crimson Veil, her lips still red from her last feeding, her clawed hands adorned with rings of enchanted silver, whispered curses into the night, summoning the wraiths and specters of Drakenhof's ancient halls. Markov the Pale, the necromancer lord, stood beside them, his skeletal fingers tracing the air, weaving runes of protection, his whispering voice calling upon the legions of dead warlords that had long served the Von Carstein. And below, within the courtyard, an army of the night gathered. Vampiric knights in blackened plate armor, mounted on undead steeds, their lances burning with sorcerous flame. Necromancers leading hosts of skeletal warriors, their soulless eyes locked in a silent march of obedience. Great monstrous horrors, the undead behemoths of old wars, their stitched flesh pulsing with dark magic, their eyes filled with the hunger of centuries. This was not a battle of mortals. This was a war between monsters, and it would decide the fate of Sylvania. The first clash. The gates of Drakenhof burst open with a thunderous roar. The dead surged forward, a storm of wights and revenants, their rusted blades flashing in the rain, their battle cries shrieking through the air. Valerius' horde answered. Ghouls leapt into the fray, their claws slicing through steel and flesh, their fangs sinking into the throats of enemy vampires. Wights clashed with skeletal knights, their cursed blades howling with ancient fury, their armor cracked and rusted but unyielding. The Vargulfs howled as they tore through necromancers, their massive claws ripping apart the robed figures before they could utter their final incantations. The battlefield became a slaughterhouse. A vampire knight lunged for Valerius, his sword wreathed in dark fire, but Valerius caught the blade with his clawed hand, crushing the steel before driving his fangs into the knight's throat, tearing out his spine in one fluid motion. Blood splashed across the stones. A giant, undead behemoth charged, swinging a mace the size of a horse, but Valerius dodged beneath the strike, slamming his claws into the creature's ribcage, ripping out its corrupted heart in a spray of ichor. Nothing could stop him. He moved through the battlefield like a force of nature, a storm of fangs and fury, carving a path of ruin toward the great gates of Drakenhof. And standing upon those gates, waiting for him, was Lord Valerius Von Carstein. The duel of kings. The rain poured harder, the thunder cracking the sky, as Valerius stood before the master of Drakenhof. 2 kings, 2 legacies. One would leave this battlefield alive. Merrick's voice was calm, cold, filled with centuries of command. "You have come far," he said, his crimson eyes gleaming beneath the storm. "But you are still nothing more than a beast wearing a crown stolen from a corpse." Valerius snarled. "You call me a beast, Merrick," he growled, his massive claws flexing, the talon of usherin glowing in his grip. "But tonight, the beast devours you." Merrick moved first. His blade flashed through the storm, cutting toward Valerius' heart. Valerius met it with a roar, his claws clashing against steel, sending a shockwave through the battlefield. They clashed again and again, their strikes shattering the stone beneath them, cracking the very air with the force of their blows. Merrick was fast, his sword a blur of ancient technique, striking at Valerius with the precision of a master. But Valerius was relentless, his strength monstrous, his fury unyielding. Merrick drove his sword through Valerius' side, cutting deep into flesh and muscle. But Valerius did not falter. He seized Merrick by the throat, lifting him into the air, his claws sinking into his rival's flesh. "Your time is over," he snarled. Merrick struggled, his eyes burning with fury, but there was something else there, too. Recognition. The unthinkable truth. Valerius was stronger. He had won. And with a final monstrous roar, Valerius tore Merrick's head from his shoulders, ripping his spine free in a geyser of blood. The Lord of Drakenhof was dead. The Von Carsteins had fallen, and Valerius stood, alone, atop the corpses of the old kings, wearing the crown of usherin, victorious. The twilight of Sylvania. Drakenhof burned. The last remnants of the Von Carstein dynasty were slaughtered, their corpses added to the ever-growing legions of Valerius's undead. The hunger had won. The curse had been broken. Valerius was no longer an exile, no longer a prince. He was a king, and Sylvania would never be the same again. Chapter 26. The Banquet of Blood. A night without a dawn. Drakenhof was aflame. The great fortress of the Von Carsteins, a place that had stood for centuries, a seat of power from which lords of the night had ruled in arrogance, was now a crumbling ruin, its walls painted in the blood of its former masters. Smoke and ashes coiled into the storm-choked sky, rising from the shattered towers, mixing with the screams of the dying aristocracy, their once immaculate robes now soaked with filth and gore. The feast had begun, and Valerius Von Carstein was the butcher at its heart. The gathering of the doomed. The remaining vampire lords had retreated to the great hall, a chamber that had once hosted opulent feasts, political intrigues, and the whispered conspiracies of the undead elite. Now it was a slaughterhouse. Corpses littered the long banquet tables, their faces frozen in masks of shock, their throats torn open. Blood dripped from the chandeliers, pooling onto the marble floor, where dying nobles crawled through the filth, gasping for air they no longer needed. The wine goblets had been knocked aside, now filled not with crimson vintage, but with the steaming, black blood of their former owners. And at the center of it all, Valerius stood. His fanged grin split wide, his crimson eyes burning, his monstrous claws dripping with the remnants of his latest kill. The war among kings. The surviving vampire lords still clung to their pride, despite the carnage around them. Countess Ulrika of the Crimson Veil, her blood-stained dress torn, her fingernails curved into daggers of bone, hissed like a cornered animal, her once perfect beauty now twisted with rage and desperation. Markov the Pale, the necromancer lord. His body a shriveled husk, his fingers still clutching a staff wreathed in flickering dark light, his mind calculating, seeking a way to twist this chaos to his advantage. Lord Gregor of Tempelhof, a warrior clad in heavy black plate, his massive Zweihänder resting upon his shoulder, his eyes empty of fear, only seething with the fury of a doomed knight. They did not kneel. They did not beg. They fought. The final battle begins. Ulrika struck first. She moved like a serpent, vanishing into the shadows, reappearing behind Valerius in a blur, her razor-sharp claws slashing for his throat. But Valerius was faster. He spun, catching her by the wrist, twisting until bones snapped. She screamed, but he was not finished. He seized her by the waist, lifting her into the air, then drove his fangs into her stomach, tearing through flesh and muscle, feasting upon the marrow within. She shrank in his grasp, her body withering, her centuries of stolen youth drained away in seconds, until she was nothing but a withered husk, her face frozen in horror. Valerius let her corpse drop to the floor. One down. The sorcerer's doom. Markov the Pale unleashed his power. Black lightning erupted from his skeletal fingers, crackling through the air, twisting into serpentine shapes that screeched and howled as they coiled around Valerius. The spells struck. They burned. They tore at his flesh, unraveling his essence, seeking to rip his soul apart piece by piece. Markov laughed, a dry, whispering sound. "You think yourself a king, beast," he rasped. "You are still just a mongrel, a mistake, a horror fit only to be put down." Valerius did not fall. He did not break. Instead, he laughed, and then he moved. Through the pain, through the burning curses, through the magic meant to unmake him. In a blur of speed he closed the distance, his clawed hand gripping Markov's throat before the sorcerer could react. The spells died on Markov's lips. His glowing eyes flickered with realization. "No!" Valerius drove his claws into Markov's chest, his hand tearing into the necromancer's ribcage, gripping his undead heart. Then, with a monstrous snarl, he ripped it free. Markov collapsed, his body imploding into a cloud of dust, his essence consumed, his soul devoured. Two down. the last warrior. Only Gregor remained. The warrior lord did not speak. There was no plea for mercy, no last words of defiance. He simply lifted his greatsword and charged. The blade came down in a massive arc, its dark steel humming with the weight of centuries of war, a weapon that had killed kings before. But Valerius was no king that Gregor had ever faced. He was something greater, something worse. At the last second, Valerius sidestepped, his speed inhuman, his claws catching the blade mid-swing. The impact shook the hall, sending cracks rippling through the floor. For a moment they stood locked in struggle. Gregor's teeth clenched, his undead muscles straining against the monster before him. Valerius grinned. And then he bit. His fangs sank into Gregor's neck, ripping away flesh, severing veins, drinking deep. Gregor tried to swing again, but his strength was failing, his vision blurring, his soul slipping away. Valerius did not stop drinking until there was nothing left. Gregor's lifeless body crumpled, his once mighty sword falling from his grasp, his glory forgotten in an instant. It was over. The last of the old lords had fallen. The new order begins. Valerius stood amidst the corpses, his chest rising and falling, his clawed hands still dripping with the remains of his rivals. He had won. The Von Carsteins were dead. The old dynasty had fallen, and in its place a new king had risen. The crown of usherin gleamed upon his brow, a symbol not just of dominion, but of change, of a new era for the vampires of Sylvania. He was no mindless beast. He was no mere monster. He was the future. And as the dead outside the keep raised their voices in a howling, nightmarish cheer, Valerius stepped forward, his crimson eyes burning with hunger and purpose alike. Sylvania was his, but the world would come next. Chapter 27. A Throne of Bone. A kingdom of ash and blood. Sylvania was dead, not in the way it had always been, a rotting corpse of a land, teeming with things that should not walk, ruled by parasitic lords who clung to their stolen eternity like bloated leeches. No, this was different. This was annihilation. The once proud fortresses of the Von Carsteins, their black spires that had loomed over the land for centuries, now stood shattered, their stones slick with the blood of the last aristocrats who had dared resist him. The great necropolises, where ancient kings and generals had been laid to rest, were torn open, their long-dead inhabitants ripped from slumber and made to kneel in undeath. The lesser vampires, those who had once whispered of Valerius' madness, who had scoffed at the idea of a Vargulf wearing a crown, had been dragged from their gilded halls and torn apart, their power consumed, their legacies erased. No more intrigues. No more blood courts, no more whispers in the dark. Sylvania had been reforged in fire and ruin, and at its center, upon a throne crafted from the bones of the slain, sat its new master, the throne of the usurper king. The throne chamber of Drakenhof had been remade. Gone were the rich velvets, the gold-encrusted banners, the twisted mockery of imperial grandeur that the Von Carsteins had once coveted. Now the chamber was a monument of death. The walls were lined with impaled corpses, their arms frozen in their final struggles, their faces twisted into silent screams, an eternal warning to those who might think to challenge their new lord. The chandeliers no longer held candlelight, but the burning skulls of defeated warlords, their empty sockets smoldering with balefire. The great marble floor had been cracked apart, replaced with a lake of cooling blood, a crimson sea where echoes of the slain still writhed and whispered. And the throne itself, it had been fashioned from the remains of the old order, from the bones of defeated counts, the skulls of the aristocracy, the spines of once proud warlords who had dared resist. Upon this monument of ruin, Valerius sat. Neither vampire nor Vargulf. Something worse, the transformation of a king. The curse of the Vargulf was never meant to be controlled. It was a punishment, a doom, a sentence of eternal hunger and mindless rage. But Valerius had defied that fate. He had bent it to his will. The monstrous frame of the Vargulf still remained, his form massive, powerful, wrapped in thick sinew and monstrous might. But his mind was untouched by the madness that should have consumed him. His eyes, once the mindless crimson of a beast, now burned with cruel intelligence. His voice, once reduced to guttural roars, now carried the cold weight of command. His hunger had not faded, but it was no longer aimless. It was purpose. It was conquest. It was power itself. The crown of Usherin sat heavy upon his monstrous brow, its blackened bone pulsing with the memories of the first flesh-eater king, whispering of empires lost to time, of an age when the Strigoi were not just scavengers, but rulers. And now, for the first time in centuries, there was a true king once more. A king of nightmares, a king of horror, a king whose rule would not be one of scheming nobles, but of conquest. The judgment of the dead. Before him knelt the remnants of Sylvania's surviving nobility, those who had not fought, those who had surrendered, those who had fled, only to be dragged back in chains by Valerius's undead legions. Their faces were pale with something they had not known in centuries. Fear. The last of the Von Carsteins, the eldest necromancers, the ancient wights who had ruled in the shadows, all bowed before the throne of the beast who had become their king. Valerius leaned forward, his massive claws drumming against the armrest of his throne, his crimson gaze sweeping across them like a predator surveying prey. "You speak of lineage," he growled, his voice like distant thunder, each word weighted with the power of the relics he had claimed. "You speak of old blood, of your right to rule. You call me a beast." His jaws parted, revealing fangs still slick with the gore of the last noble to defy him. "But tell me, where are your kings now?" No one dared to answer. "Your line is dead. Your courts are ash. Your dominion has ended." His massive claw rose, pointing toward them with a slow, deliberate motion. "And yet here you kneel, before the beast you once mocked, begging for mercy." A long silence stretched, broken only by the distant crackling of fires, consuming what remained of the old order. Then, finally, Valerius spoke his judgment. "I have no need for parasites. I have no need for schemers and cowards who let others bleed while they hide behind stone walls. You will serve, or you will die, and those who serve will not rule." He rose from his throne, his massive frame casting a shadow over the broken nobility before him. "I will rule," and with that, the slaughter began. A new era of horror. The last nobles of Sylvania were dragged to the courtyard, their pleas ignored, their old names stripped from history. They were impaled, their bodies displayed upon the shattered walls of Drakenhof, as a warning to those who still harbored foolish ambitions. The castles of the old aristocracy were torn down, their ruins left as grave markers for a dynasty that had grown fat on complacency. The war bands that had once sworn fealty to the Von Carsteins bent the knee, not to a blood-drinking noble, but to a king of monsters. And as the first night of Valerius' reign settled over Sylvania, the land itself seemed to tremble. Something had changed. Something old had returned, and soon the rest of the world would know the terror of the king of the dead. The twilight of Sylvania had come. The age of the beast had begun. Chapter 28. The Curse Reborn. The silence after the storm. Drakenhof was his. Sylvania was his. The banners of the old lords had been torn down, their thrones shattered, their names erased in the slaughter that had ended their reign. The noble vampires were gone, their lifeblood spilled, their skulls mounted upon the gates of the keep as grim trophies. The last of the Von Carsteins had burned, their final screams drowned beneath the howls of the monstrous legions that now served a new master, and Valerius Von Carstein sat upon his throne of bone. The weight of the crown. The war was over. The crown was his. The crown of usherin, once worn by the first and only Strigoi king, now rested upon the monstrous brow of the usurper, pulsing with the memories of a dynasty that had rotted long before it had truly begun. It whispered to him, not in words, but in hunger, not in commands, but in need. He had devoured his enemies. He had conquered the kingdom that cast him out. He had become the nightmare they feared. But it was not enough. It would never be enough. Valerius' clawed fingers tightened around the arms of his throne, his jagged fangs grinding together as the realization settled into his bones, deeper than any wound, colder than any grave. He had fought for vengeance. He had fought to prove he was more than a mindless beast, that he was not just another monster to be hunted, to be caged, to be forgotten. And yet here he was, a beast upon a throne of the dead, a hunger that never ends. The crown did not feel like victory. It felt like iron shackles, binding him to something he could not escape. He could smell the blood in the air. The battle had painted Drakenhof in crimson, and even now, hours after the last enemy had fallen, the scent still lingered, thick, intoxicating, filling his lungs with the promise of more. More flesh. More power, more death. He had feasted upon lords and knights, upon warlords and priests, upon the greatest of his kind. And still the hunger clawed at him. His muscles coiled, his massive claws twitching, his fangs bared in frustration. No matter how much he devoured, no matter how much he took, there was no fullness, no satisfaction, no end to the gnawing void that burned within him. Had he truly won? Or had he simply become something that could never stop? A monster unleashed. He rose from his throne, his massive Vargulf frame looming over the ruined chamber, his shadow stretching like a curse upon the cold stone walls. His servants, the ghouls, the wights, the broken remnants of warbands that had sworn themselves to his rule, watched in silence, their yellowed eyes filled with something close to reverence, yet tinged with fear. They had followed him because he was strong, because he had killed their masters and made them kneel, because they knew he was no longer just a vampire, no longer just a predator. He was something worse. But what was he? He had taken the relics of the first Strigoi king, had claimed their power, had bent the will of the dead to serve him. Yet he was still cursed, still bound to the hunger that had driven so many of his kind into madness, still more monster than king. He looked upon his own reflection, upon the shattered remnants of a silver mirror that had once belonged to Valerius Von Carstein. The creature that stared back at him was not the Prince of Sylvania, not the cunning noble who had played the games of vampire courts, who had worn silk and whispered in candlelit halls. It was something far beyond that, a thing of war and blood, a thing that did not belong in a throne room, but in a battlefield of endless carnage. He was not Valerius Von Carstein anymore. He was not a man. He was not a noble. He was hunger. He was death, the curse reborn. The realization struck him like a blade to the heart. There was no going back. There was nothing left to return to. Even if he had wanted to rule Sylvania as a true lord, as a vampire monarch commanding the night with the elegance of an aristocrat, it was too late. The hunger had changed him. The throne beneath him was just another corpse, another conquest, and it would not satisfy him. Nothing would. A low guttural growl rumbled from his throat, his clawed hand gripping his own chest, feeling the slow, steady beat of his unnatural heart. This was his fate, not to reign in peace, not to rebuild an empire, but to become the horror whispered in the dark. His monstrous form trembled, his fangs parting in a cruel grin, his breath thick with the scent of blood and madness alike. If he was doomed to hunger forever, then let it be so. Let the world learn what it meant to fear him. Let them know that their cities, their castles, their false kings would all crumble beneath his wrath. He would not be caged again. He would never be forgotten. He would not be another lost monster, another cautionary tale among vampires. He would be their nightmare. And so, upon his throne of bone, beneath the stormlit sky of Sylvania, Valerius threw back his head and howled. A sound that shook the ruined halls, a sound that sent terror slithering into the hearts of all who still lived in the night, a sound that marked the rebirth of something unnatural, something beyond vampire, beyond beast, something that would never die. The curse was not broken. It had simply been reborn. Chapter 29. The Last Gift of Nagash. A Voice from the Grave. The storm howled through the ruins of Drakenhof. The sky was black with sorcery, clouds swirling like a hungry vortex, their undersides flashing with sickly green lightning. The land itself trembled, the stone walls of the once great citadel groaning as if in mourning for the fallen Von Carsteins. And amidst the storm, the ruin, and the silence of the dead, Valerius sat upon his throne of bone, his massive claws resting upon the armrests, his monstrous crimson eyes burning in the gloom. He had won. Sylvania was his. And yet he felt the weight of the hunger that could never be sated. That was when the whisper came. Soft at first, like a breeze through a crypt, curling through the air like the fingers of a corpse. A voice not spoken, but felt, slithering into his thoughts like a phantom. You wear the crown, yet you are unsatisfied. You have conquered, yet you remain unfulfilled. You have claimed dominion, yet you still hunger. Valerius' claws curled against the armrests. He knew this voice. It had haunted the dreams of every vampire, of every necromancer, of every soul who had ever sought to cheat death itself. Nagash, the great necromancer, the father of undeath, the god of the dead. And he was speaking to him. The offer of a god. The throne room darkened. The torches flickered and died, their flames swallowed by the creeping void. The storm outside fell silent, as if the world itself had ceased to exist, leaving only Valerius and the voice of the great necromancer. And then, before him, the air shimmered, rippling like disturbed water, warping and twisting, until the figure of Nagash materialized. A wraith-like giant, wrapped in robes of blackest night, his form shifting like smoke, his skeletal face hidden beneath a towering helm, his empty sockets burning with pale sorcerous fire. His presence was suffocating. His will was absolute. You have proven yourself, Valerius Von Carstein, the voice echoed, impossibly deep, impossibly ancient, layered with the whispers of 1,000 restless spirits. Nagash raised a bony hand, and visions flooded Valerius's mind. The world consumed in eternal night. The empire of man reduced to ruins, its people enslaved as shambling dead, their cities turned to graves. The old world bowing before a new god. Him. Valerius, not just as king, not just as a monster, but as a god of undeath. Nagash's skeletal fingers curled, and the darkness seemed to press closer. Kneel, and I will give you power beyond imagining, the voice intoned. Become my champion, my chosen, and together we shall extinguish all that still clings to life. The war within. The temptation was undeniable. To be more than just a vampire. To transcend even the curse of hunger. To become something eternal. Valerius stared into the abyss of Nagash's presence, and for a moment he saw his own reflection within it, a figure wreathed in dark majesty, his monstrous form clad in sorceress armor, his armies stretching across the world like a black tide. No more hunger, no more limits. He would not just rule Sylvania. He would consume the world. And yet, something inside him rebelled. His massive clawed hands clenched, his fangs grinding together as the whisper of another voice echoed in his mind. Not nagash, not the cursed hunger that had haunted him since his transformation, but his own voice. No, I have been a pawn before. I have been used, betrayed, twisted by the will of others. Never again. I will not kneel, not to Drakenhof, not to the Von Carsteins, and not to you. I am not your slave, Nagash. I am no one's slave. I am the master of my own fate. Then you will perish. The wrath of the great necromancer. The temperature in the chamber plummeted. Nagash's presence surged, filling the throne room with the weight of death itself. The walls cracked, the bones that made up Valerius' throne twisted and shrieked, and the very stones beneath his feet blackened with necrotic rot. The great necromancer's power crashed down upon Valerius like a tidal wave. It sought to consume him, to strip him down to nothing, to erase him, to remind him that none defied Nagash and lived. But Valerius did not bow. He rose. He roared, and he fought. The talon of usherin flared with unholy power, and for the first time Valerius did not merely endure Nagash's will, he pushed back. Lightning cracked. The air burned. Reality itself twisted as two forces of undeath clashed. Nagash, the god of the dead, the architect of undeath. Valerius, the usurper, the beast that had conquered a kingdom, the king who had refused to be chained. The throne of bone shattered beneath him, the stone walls collapsed outward, the howl of 1,000 tormented spirits shrieking through the night. And when the darkness cleared, Nagash was gone, but Valerius still stood, a path of his own making. The storm above Drakenhof raged on, but inside all was silent. Nagash had come to make him his servant, and he had refused. He had survived the gaze of a god, and now he would carve his own destiny, not as a king of old, not as a noble of the past, not as a monster serving another's will. He would become something new, something that even Nagash had not foreseen, and soon the world would learn to fear him. Chapter 30. The Forgotten Prince Ascends. A world without kings. Sylvania burned, not with the fires of war nor the wrath of Sigmar's crusades, but with something colder, something eternal. The old order lay in ruins, its castles turned to crypts, its once proud vampire lords nothing more than shattered bones upon the blood-stained ground. The Von Carsteins were dead. The Strigoi had a king once more, but he did not sit upon a throne. Valerius Von Carstein was no longer a prince. For centuries he had been bound to others' wills, the cursed blood of his lineage, the madness of the Var Gulf, the whispers of Nagash. He had been shaped by vengeance, by betrayal, by a hunger that had never been his own choice. No more. The world had tried to chain him. He had torn those chains apart, and now he chose nothingness. The last night of the usurper king. The ruins of Drakenhof stood silent, a grave not just for the vampires who had ruled Sylvania, but for the very idea of dominion itself. The halls that once echoed with whispers of intrigue and ancient ambition were now hollow, filled only with the wind that carried the stench of undeath. In the throne chamber, where once he had challenged Nagash himself, Valerius stood alone. The crown of usherin lay at his feet. The talon of usherin, the relic he had wielded in war, now sat beside it, lifeless, its power no longer needed. He had claimed them to become something more. But a crown meant nothing. A throne meant nothing. He did not rule, he did not kneel, he did not belong. His massive, monstrous frame was wrapped in shadow, his crimson eyes staring at the ruined remnants of the world he had conquered. It was not enough. It had never been enough. The hunger still burned within him, but now he understood. There was no end to it. Not for vampires, not for gods, not for monsters. He had spent his undeath proving he was more than a beast. Now he accepted that he was neither beast nor lord. He was something in between. Something forgotten. Something worse. The vanishing of the nightmare. The night stretched on, and then Valerius was gone. No one saw him leave Drakenhof. No one heard his footsteps upon the shattered stones of the keep. No one watched as the last king of Sylvania abandoned his throne, his crown, his war, and faded into the darkness beyond. He did not ride at the head of armies. He did not sit in halls of nobility. He did not kneel before gods. He was something else, a shadow upon the cursed lands, a whisper upon the wind, a hunger that never rested, never ruled, never ceased. The forgotten prince had ascended, the legends that remained. Time passed, but the memory of Valerius Von Carstein did not fade. In the villages of Stirland, where men still feared the cursed lands of Sylvania, the peasants spoke of a thing that watched from the tree line, a beast neither dead nor living, whose eyes burned in the night. In the great keeps of the remaining vampire lords, the whispers spoke of something lurking in the ruins of the fallen dynasties, a predator that did not scheme, did not claim titles, but hunted. In the cairns of the Strigoi, the cursed and the broken offered prayers to the nameless horror that had once worn a crown, fearing that one day he might return to reclaim his lost kin. He had become more than a king, more than a legend. He had become fear itself. The final hunt begins, and as the centuries stretched on, as Sylvania continued its cycle of ruin and rebirth, one truth remained. There was still something in the dark, still something moving in the forgotten crypts, in the shattered ruins of a kingdom that had never truly died. Still something watching, waiting, hungering, not for a throne, not for a title, not for vengeance, but for the hunt, for the thrill of blood and death and shadow, for the only purpose that had ever truly belonged to him. And so the forgotten prince vanished into legend, but the night was never safe again.